Chapter 1078. Ramsey, west of Emerald City, 100,000 mountains. The hunting hall was well lit, warm and bright. Leftover pork was being forked over a fire in the distance. The bones and the last pieces of meat had already turned dark brown, and the fragrance filled the hall. When Harriman entered, the mastiffs all started barking excitedly. Several couples got up from the benches to welcome him, hugging his arms, shoulders, and hands. Of the people in his father's house, some were his father's relatives, some were people who had sworn allegiance to him, but most of them were traders and merchants, as well as some emissaries from other lords and lands. At this moment, everyone was happy and relieved that Harriman had returned safely. He expressed his gratitude to them. He didn't want to offend them. However, when they touched his injured arm, he subconsciously took a step back. He didn't want to stay at the door with these people. The swordsman who followed Hallimand was well aware of Hallimand's intentions even before he heard the words of those people. "Welcome time ends here." After a while, the swordsman said with a cold expression. He passed through the crowd and cleared a path for Harriman. "Let him pass. Now his mother will want to kiss his beardless cheek." Harriman nodded gratefully to the old warrior, then fled. He passed through the long room, past the tall rafters and roof beams that were blackened by smoke, as well as the latest woven tapestries his father had just bought from King's Landing City. Those who felt that they shouldn't approach Harriman at the door were not acquaintances of Harriman, nor did they have any status. These people bowed to Harriman as he passed by, and Harriman nodded in return. One of them caught Hallimand's attention. It was a man of about the same age as him, perhaps slightly older. He was wearing a warrior's armor, but he carried a large spear on his back. He should be a musketeer. There was a scar from his left cheek to his neck, and his black braids were dyed brown by the firelight in the room. Harriman had never seen this man before, but he recognized the man standing beside him. This man was from Yomi's, but he had long stopped being a pirate and turned to trade. He had a lot of trade with Jadewood City. In addition, there was a dwarf named Grindel beside them. Many years ago, he had been the chief engineer of the southern mines of Emeraldwood City. After that, the dwarf traveled to other planes. When he returned this year, he paid a visit to his former employer, Green, who was also Harriman's father. Green even held a banquet for him, and it was at that banquet that Harriman got to know him. As Harriman passed before them, they bowed their heads in acknowledgement of his presence. Harriman saw the curiosity in the young man's eyes. It was as if he was seeing the son of King Green for the first time, and seeing someone with the name Harad for the first time. He nodded to the three of them in response, wondering who this person was as he continued to walk to the end of the hunting house. He walked past his father's high seat, around the carved walls that separated the hall from the private areas of the family, and entered the meeting hall. His father was receiving a small group of envoys, and the meeting wouldn't be over for a while. Even after it was over, he would still need to discuss with the advisors for a while. Harriman felt that he had nothing to do, so he didn't disturb the people in the meeting hall. He stuck close to the wall and walked to an oak door. He carefully pushed the door open and walked down the steps, entering the basement of the hunting house. Unlike the Green family's mansion in Emeraldwood City, this hunting house was actually just a Green family's villa in the mountains to the west. The overall shape of the house was like a ship with only 3 floors above ground. There was no prison or other ancillary buildings underground, only an inconspicuous small wine cellar. Harriman's father would only come here once every few years, partly to visit Harriman, who was stationed here, and partly to meet with the various powers in the west of Emeraldwood City. However, as the mansion he lived in all year round, Harriman had developed an underground laboratory around the wine cellar according to his interests. It was used to tinker with some of his favorite gadgets. The building above the laboratory was a beast pen located at the northeast corner of the hunting house. Because Harriman rarely hunted prey from the mountains, the place was basically in a half-abandoned state. The laboratory wasn't small, with a width of no more than 20 steps, but a length of more than 50 steps. It wasn't inferior to the indoor dueling grounds of some nobles. Although the ceiling was a little low, when one turned on the eternal flame lamp controlled by the runic stone switch, yellow light would fill the room from the ceiling. Because Harriman didn't allow his servants to casually enter his laboratory, this room was rarely cleaned. It was always messy, as if a group of crazy peddlers had just set up their stalls. But because of a sudden storm, they hurriedly packed up and left, leaving behind this mess. A wooden laboratory table that was almost as long as the wall was filled with items. There were slender glass tubes, various boxes, cloth bags filled with pungent-smelling powder, wood and metal materials, and complicated components made up of distillation bottles and tubes, as well as various containers. In the center of the laboratory table, there was a delicately carved, three-legged ivory cauldron with a large copper ball floating in a silver liquid. Several curved and protruding nozzles on the ball were emitting steam, while the copper ball slowly rotated. On the floor and shelves of the room, there were even more strange items: polished stones, gorse, and leather wings. There were also many metal cages by the side. Some were empty, while others contained strange creatures with coarse fur or strange feathers. Transparent, crystal-like papers were casually piled up by the curtain wall. Furthermore, there were many books in this room. Some were half-closed, while others were standing upright. They covered the entire room like huge and clumsy butterflies. Other than that, the only shelf near the wall that could be considered neat had some glass balls on it. The balls were filled with bubbling, colorful liquid, but they were not hot. There were also some boxes that seemed to be made of glass, containing shiny, black gravel. The gravel was constantly arranged on its own, as if it was constantly being stirred by a breeze that came out of nowhere. It never took a second for it to settle down. Walking into his toy room, Harriman, who felt much more relaxed, couldn't help but whistle. He first took 2 quick steps forward, then crouched down, and like a squirrel in spring, he started digging at the corner of the wall. The piles of scrolls, spell cloths with runes drawn on them, and small cups and plates that were originally placed there were all thrown behind him. Finally, he stood up again, hugging a huge glass box. He struggled to walk to the laboratory table and put down the box. Then, he seemingly casually grabbed a pair of flasks from a shelf beside him. One of the flasks contained a liquid that was the color of the sunset, and smoke was coming out of it like an incense burner. The other flask was filled with a viscous blue liquid. Harriman poured the 2 types of potions into the glass box at the same time. The blue liquid flowed very, very slowly. When they finally mixed together, it became a clean and transparent liquid that was as fresh as the air on a mountaintop. The young master of the Green family waved his arms like a traveling entertainer. He accidentally pulled on the wound on his arm, causing him to gasp in pain. Chapter 1079. At this moment, a hurried knock on the door interrupted Harriman's gasp. "Who is it?" He turned his head and asked. "It's me," a gloomy voice answered. After a long pause, the voice continued. "It's me, Old Weather, the bone stubble of the bone devourer." Harriman cursed in a low voice. He always liked to use strange words. "Open the door yourself. I don't have the strength to run back and forth for an old fool." The door opened inwards, and the light in the corridor illuminated the person who came in. He seemed to be quite tall, but the strange appearance of his bowed head made it difficult to accurately judge him. A moment later, an expressionless round face appeared, like a full moon floating in the night sky, hanging weakly in front of his chest. The hair on the top of his head was as messy as grass. The person who cut his hair must have used a very blunt razor and was not skilled enough to cut his hair. "My apologies for disturbing you, young Master Hallamant. But it was your father who called me over. He hopes that you can come to the conference hall and have a chat." That person's voice was heavy and slow, like a slow dripping lard. "I got it. You can leave now." Harriman nodded and waved his uninjured arm, hinting for Weather to be tactful and leave this place. The latter was quite perceptive and saw Harriman's impatience. He immediately bowed and left the laboratory, not forgetting to close the oak door again when he went out. After waiting for about a minute, when the colorless liquid in the glass box no longer emitted smoke, Harriman unbuttoned his clothes and pulled down his sleeve, revealing his bandaged arm. He untied the blood-stained gauze, lifted the glass box with one hand, and poured all the liquid in the box onto his injured arm. Like an earthworm crawling, the colorless liquid did not fall to the ground, but all of it went into the wound. Phew, looking at the wound that healed at a speed visible to the naked eye, and the swelling of his biceps that gradually subsided, Harriman finally breathed a sigh of relief. Previously, his father had ordered him to hunt that pack of ferocious badgers. It had truly been difficult for the scholar who had just graduated from Junlin City University. Without the berserker's armor, he could only use the method of exchanging injuries with his sword, allowing the leading ferocious badger to break its yellowed canine teeth between the muscles of his arm. Only then did he successfully kill the group of ferocious beasts one by one. "The old man is never wrong," Harriman said in a self-deprecating manner. He scratched his head and put on his clothes again. Before he left, he didn't forget to throw the bloody gauze into the three-legged ivory cauldron with a copper ball floating in the middle of the experiment table. The silver liquid surged twice and cleaned the bloodstains and even disinfected the cauldron. Then, Harriman used his fingers to fish the gauze out of the cauldron and used the steam from the copper ball to quickly dry it. He then folded the gauze and put it back into the bag at his waist. Previously, there was a time when he forgot to clean up the bloodstained gauze. As a result, a Kwai Kaling escaped from the laboratory and stole it. That little scoundrel almost stole it and sold it to a spellcaster who was at odds with the Green family. In the end, a spy from the Scales of Eternity Merchant Guild stepped in and bought it back, saving Halliman's life. That time was actually quite dangerous. If he had been cursed to death by a spellcaster, Harriman, who had yet to graduate from Junlin City University but already received the honorary title of Herald, would most likely become the Herald who held this title for the shortest period of time. After all, he was only 22 years old and received the title of Herald less than a year and a half ago. It had only been half a year since he graduated from Junlin City University. Although it was said to be a chat, it was actually a banquet held in the main hall of the hunting house. The fire in the stove was burning brightly. Harriman's mother was draped in silk from the Japanese mulberry region from another plane. She was wearing bright gold and silver ornaments. She passed a horn cup filled with honey wine to his father and the various local lords and nobles who came to visit. Mayor Green was wearing the traditional hunting attire of Emerald Wood City. Although he was nearing 70 years old, his appearance was no different from a man in his 30s. There was an outsider who also looked like a man in his prime sitting beside Green. It looked like he was a soft maple who lived on a new peninsula that appeared on the edge of the continent after the war in the Ramsey Plain a few decades ago. This soft maple man looked like a completely different type of ruler. His arms were full of armbands, his fingers were full of rings, his shoulders were wrapped in fur, his waist was embroidered, and his belt was hung with jewels. These were no doubt the spoils of war he had plundered many times. He looked like he had experienced more than 40 summers and winters. Judging from the scars all over his body, there must have been many torturous days. He was in high spirits when he ate and laughed. It was probably similar to how Harriman imagined him to be when he was angry on the battlefield. It seems that the rumors of the ladies of Black Willow City being very friendly are true. Taking the wine and the horn cup, the man said, "Queen of the Green family, your beauty and elegance are well known, but now I feel that those stories are not fair enough." Harriman's mother nodded and said, "Thank you for your praise, Mayor Greasus." Gurman knew very well that every man who came to this hall felt that it was their duty to praise the Green family. Although they secretly hated and distrusted the alliance of two cities represented by Harriman's father and mother. But Grizzly's praise seemed sincere. "If the women of Black Willow City were as beautiful and virtuous as you," the soft maple man continued, "I promise to let my little brats, after the New Year's ceremony, each of them will take a boat there to find a wife." Harriman's mother laughed and said, "If you flatter every woman in this hall, I will wonder why you still need to ally with the Green family, Mayor Greasus." Greasus grinned and said, "Then do you know why I'm here?" "Of course we know." Green, who was sipping the honey wine, finally opened his mouth, but his voice sounded a little insulted. "But I think it's better to wait until we're full before we discuss that matter in detail." The soft maple man pointed at the spacious main hall. "I believe that the men and women here are actually very happy to hear what I have to say here." "No," Green said firmly. Let's talk in private. The soft maple man picked up a toothpick and picked out something from his teeth. He then nodded and said, "As you wish." Chapter 1080. When the lords talk, they talk about honor, but in their hearts, they're still thinking about business. Harriman's ears were sharp, so he heard the words of the young gunslinger 2 seats away from him. The gunslinger's eyes were unfocused, as if he had drunk too much wine and his brain had become sluggish. However, Halliman felt that this person still maintained a rare sense of vigilance and insight. At the very least, his eyes did see something. Just this point alone made him much better than most of the guests present. Harriman stood up from his seat and pretended to toast with others as he walked toward the young man. When he approached him, the young master of the Green Clan also casually raised his cup and drank with him. However, in private, he asked in a low voice, "Excuse me, mister, do you have a premonition?" As he spoke, he did not look directly at the young man, but at the spear that the young man had casually placed on the table. This did not mean that Harriman was arrogant, but he was after all a Harad, and when dealing with people, it was not as accurate as looking at certain technological products. With just a glance, Harriman could tell that there was something unusual about the spear. It did not seem to be a flintlock spear. Moreover, although there were complicated inscriptions under the oily stains of the spear, it was not an enchanted weapon. Not only that, some of the small components on the spear reminded Harriman of something he had personally disassembled in a mechanical practical class when he was studying in King's Landing City. "I'm not a prophet." The musketeer sitting at the table waved his hand and said to Harriman, "But I'm an old hunter who's used to going to various cities. Just like when winter comes, whether it's the king or the slaves, most of them can only rely on the crops they harvest in the autumn to feed themselves. Many things are traceable, and once you're used to seeing them, you can always guess pretty much what happened." "I'm not convinced." Harriman finished the last piece of pork on his fork, and then picked a flat piece of bread from the gunslinger's table to ease the grease in his mouth. The taste of the fatty meat and the fragrance of the wheat made him feel like he had returned to the days when he was wandering in the forest. It was not that good, but it was not bad either. As he chewed, he said, "War will always find the king first, regardless of whether it is invited sincerely or not. And this is also another way to pass winter, other than the method you mentioned." "You are right." The gunslinger drank a mouthful of malt beer, grabbed a piece of venison rib, and took 2 bites, and then naturally burped, seemingly not caring about what Harriman had just said. But, although the weeds come uninvited, careful farmers know how to prevent them from destroying the crops. What about the flood and famine? The old people used to say that it was the arrangement of fate. Harriman. Cowards believe that as long as they avoid battle, they can live forever. But they do not know that there is no truce between man and death. The gunslinger threw the venison rib on the table, and Harriman noticed that the gunslinger had now sat up straight. When you see your own fate, there's only one thing you can do: face it. Furthermore, the headquarters of the Scale of Perpetual Order in King's Landing City maintains close contact with all the cities, and disaster warnings are always timely, and the grain trade route has never been cut off. Harriman smiled. The night was getting darker, and the guests attending the hunting house banquet quickly cleared their plates. They ate as quickly as the food was served. The juice of malt and honey wine flowed down their necks and beards like a waterfall. However, it was soon time for the meeting. As the host, Grimm stood up from his seat and led the few people in the hall to the meeting room. Behind him was Harriman's mother, followed by the mayor of Maple City, and at the very end was Harriman. "My apologies for interrupting your speech." Entering the meeting room, Grimm first greeted the mayor of Maple City, who was called Grisus and had the title of Ring Breaker. The other party was not too polite. "No need to apologize," Grisus said. "Come, let us begin the meeting that should have started long ago. It is best if the prince can also hear what I am about to say." As he spoke, he nodded to Harriman. Although Harriman wanted to explain that there was no such thing as a prince in Emerald City, Grimm stopped him with a look. Harriman sat on the right side of the throne, next to his mother, and then his father had the mayor of Maple City sit opposite them. Grisus stretched out his hand, as if to take the malt wine in front of him. This was obviously an unintentional action out of habit, but because there was nothing on the table, he just put his empty hand on the linen covering the table. It seems that the reason I am here is no longer a secret. We should all keep a little sober. The burly man nodded and continued. I want to talk about the island that has recently appeared in the Ramsey Plain. The Yomians brought some foreigners and conquered some of the natives there. It is said that those natives are the descendants of the Agent family that once had a close relationship with Dwarf Island. Now, the Yomians only have a small part of the land that has not been touched. Of course, we have already heard the news of their victory. Harriman's father, Grim of Emerald City, nodded, agreeing with Grisus's words. That place will not be easily conquered, the mayor of Maple City added. I don't know how that place managed to transport a temple of steam from Dwarf Island in one piece. They also have a powerful lord named Sinjar Ironhide. The Yamshan army definitely won't be able to take down the last settlement on the island. So, I'm gathering a fleet that's even larger than before. We're going to meet up with the Yamshans at sea. Together, our army will conquer all the remaining agents of the Agent family, leaving no land for them to reproduce. He looked at the indifferent Grim and then at Harriman. Any warrior who joins us will be able to obtain fame, wealth, and land. War will find the king first, whether invited or not, Harriman recalled the ancient prophecy. The mayor of Maple City must have heard some rumors. Grim of Emerald City still had a long time to live, and this king was unwilling to hand over his wealth and land to his only son so early. Harriman had to find other land and farmland, or else he would never have anything that belonged to him. And this could also explain why this next-generation successor of the Grimm family was driven out of Emeraldwood City by Grimm, leading several dozen people to guard a big hunting house in the Western Mountains for 2 whole years. Although Grimm had purposely spread this out for others to hear, Harriman's mother and the loyal Oath Knights in the family all knew part of the real reason. However, Harriman still wanted to leave this hunting house and travel to other parts of the world to have a look. However, he knew that Grisus did not only want his sword. As Grimm's son, he should bring a ship full of crew to the battlefield. However, Harriman was not foolish enough to take the initiative to speak because he did not want to give his father a reason to drive him out of the meeting hall. Chapter 1081. Once upon a time, Dwarf Island and its agent families were very powerful. I also know that through war, we can win the wealth in the newly emerged ancient heritage. Grimm gestured for everyone to look around. Some of the decorations and utensils in this room are made of refined silver. The materials were obtained from the war that established the structure of Ramsey. Your achievements are renowned far and wide, Grimm said sincerely. Even among the soft maple people, the Battle of Razor Ridge is still being talked about by many people. It's fascinating. Harriman straightened his back and raised his head proudly. These are all achievements from many years ago, Grimm said calmly. That was a different era. Now what you're talking about is not just plunder and money, but crowns. You and I both know that even if all the agent survivors of Dwarf Island are conquered by the Yomians, the crown that determines their ownership will only be placed on the head of the right person. There's no such thing as first come, first served. You're speculating too much, Mr. Grimm. Grimm opened his arms and raised his hands, his fingers shining with golden light. Lord Keys of the Scale of Perpetual Order is a master of honor. He will reward those who survive and let people praise the warriors who sacrifice themselves in the war. Also, I swear to you that the land and treasures obtained from this expedition will be distributed fairly. What if you and the Yomians can't completely conquer the island? Although the island isn't big, it's at least 1/5 the size of the Ramsey continent. Grimm seemed unmoved and continued to speak rationally. Then the Yomians, the soft maple, and the camel, polar bear, and walrus mercenaries will start to fight over the marshes on the island. Won't they? Your doubts are an insult to all the warriors of the expedition. Grimm's jaw and mouth tightened. However, his expression was not completely wrinkled. It was obvious that he was prepared for a soft rebuff. We will definitely defeat the survivors of the felons. Maybe you will. Halamang waited for Mon's father to pause for a moment. Perhaps with the help of the soft maple people, the expeditionary army's chances of success will be greater. However, Emeraldwood City and the 100,000 mountains under its rule won't send you ships and soldiers. They are needed here. What do you need them to do? Griss's face became visibly displeased, and his voice became harsh. Protect the lambs and cattle you keep here? Or guard your dock so that you can continue to deceive those passing merchant ships that need repairs? He pointed his finger at Grim. Don't think that no one will notice your tricks. Harriman did not know how his father would respond, but he instinctively leaned forward. At this moment, he suddenly felt that even if he couldn't escape from the hunting house that he was forced to guard, there would still be some interesting things that would be enough to change his mood. Mayor Grisus, don't think that no one here has noticed your rudeness. Harriman's mother, who was also the sister of the current mayor of Black Willow City, suddenly spoke out. Do you need me to remind you? Today you're my husband's guest. I haven't forgotten, Grisus said sternly. But I can't let your father's disrespect to the soft maple people go unpunished. Looking at this fat lord who was dressed like a barbarian, Harriman suddenly recalled some historical records that he had read in the Grand Library of King's Landing City. Although it was just a hobby that he had read during his leisure time, Harriman, who was born with a good memory, still remembered the general content of the book. There is no such thing as the soft maple people in Ramsey. This name is just a kind of nostalgia for the city that once existed. It's just a name used by the descendants of that city. Harriman closed his eyes and took a light breath through his nose. All the words on the book came bouncing into his eyes. Soft Maple City was the first city to be fully commercialized among the 5 cities of Ramsey. Therefore, it lacked a standing army. On the day of the cataclysm, Soft Maple City was the first city to be breached. Except for the majority of the residents who were saved by Lord Key's ingenious plan, there was nothing noteworthy about the various battles that unfolded around Soft Maple City. After the end of the war, the city completely became history. The glorious and prosperous King's Landing City rose from the ruins. Only a small number of large families fled before the city was breached, totaling 36,000 people. Because they were unable to be accepted as residents of King's Landing City, they could only settle down in the new peninsula that was uplifted from the sea and land after the Great War. They called themselves the Soft Maple People. Their natural disposition was belligerent, but they were not good at battle. Although Grisus's sudden hostility had somewhat disturbed the process of the conversation, Green still didn't show his emotions. The mature ruler's voice and manner remained calm. In addition to the reasons I've just told you, there's also a group of fugitive Japanese warriors wandering in the 100,000 mountains. It's said that they've also formed an alliance with a strange monk and a demonic fish that escaped the war by hibernating. This is also the reason why I refuse to send people or ships to join you. Before the threat to this land is resolved, Emeraldwood City can't send any soldiers or ships out. Yes, of course. Grisus nodded. Those people are eager for war and conquest, and it's this reason that makes them strong. Grisus raised his eyebrows and pretended to soften his tone. But what are you going to do? If your land is in danger, you'll definitely want to go to war with them. You have to strike first before those people become strong. Otherwise, your danger will multiply. But, Lord Green, have you ever thought about where you'll get the money to recruit additional soldiers and send them to patrol the mountains? It was rumored that in the early winter, the mayor of Black Willow City, Harriman's uncle, had proposed a similar strategy when he visited Emeraldwood City. But Harriman wasn't in Emeraldwood City at that time. He didn't hear anything, although he knew that his father would probably never initiate a war. Now, listening to Grisus's words, he inexplicably recalled the young soldier who had chatted with him about the fields and weeds in the banquet hall. Similarly, he also wanted to know if this soft maple person had found the right way to cut into the topic. Obviously, you can't delay any longer, Grisus said sternly. Harriman's mother cleared her throat and said, No offense, but what I want to say is, since when did the soft maple people need to give their opinions on this matter? This isn't your land. The people here don't belong to you, and those roving bandits aren't your problem. Yes, I am indeed a soft maple person. Grisus stood up and leaned over the long table, his two fists pressed in front of him. But my people have not become weak, like our ancestors, and now we are familiar with war. After the last mayor left office, I rediscovered my people's ambition, and we've been bleeding ever since. I'm proud to say that some of the blood is mine, my 2 sons and a grandson's. He began to tremble from the anger of the memories, but he didn't try to hide it. For 15 years, I've known nothing but war. That's why I went to that island. If I have to start a war, I'd rather kill the descendants of those agents. If I must fight endlessly, then I will fight for the land, for the lasting peace I desire, and pass it on to my children and grandchildren without end. Chapter 1082. I admire your goal. Harriman's father, Grim, who had remained calm from the start, stood up. His body was as firm as a rock. I have the same wish. I want to leave behind a strong and everlasting Emerald Wood City for my children and grandchildren. This is the biggest reason why I can't send you ships and men. You are going to fight a meaningless war. War is war, Grisus suddenly roared. Fortunately, there was a silencing formation in the conference hall, so the fat man's voice did not reach the hall outside and disturb the feast that was still going on and seemed to be going on for some time. Harriman thought that Grim would refute the man's sophistry, but he remained silent. Harriman really wanted to know what his father was thinking. Of course, even if he asked, his father, who was used to educating him through action, would not reveal his thoughts to Harriman before he realized it himself. Thus, he looked at his mother, who was also looking at his father, waiting for him to speak. However, Grim still did not answer. She turned back to look at Grisus. I believe I have made it very clear. The matter of Emerald Wood City has nothing to do with your war. Grisus shook his head. You are harming your child. I am the one who decides what is good for my son. Grim glared at him. His patience had finally reached its limit. Not a descendant of a merchant from Emerald Wood City who lacks land, fanaticism for war, and does not know how to maintain etiquette in front of king. Grisus slammed his fist on the table. Harriman instinctively jumped up. A hunting knife that he usually used to cut up food appeared in his hand. He was ready to fight at any time. His parents, on the other hand, were still sitting in their original seats, coldly sizing up Grisus. However, 2 oath warriors covered in black armor jumped out from behind the tapestry in the conference hall. Their iron boots stepped on the uncarpeted floor, but they did not make any sound. Seeing this, the leader of the Emerald Wood people immediately leaned back and opened his palm. Please forgive my impatience. His face was still red as he bit his lips. I came here to form an alliance, not to make enemies. We are not enemies of the soft maple people, at least not in the past. We even fought side by side, Harriman's mother said. As the first daughter of Black Willow City's ruling family, she had her own knowledge and experience. She knew that both men needed a way out. We only refused to give you ships and manpower, but we didn't deny our previous friendship. This isn't worth it. Grisus lowered his chin to his chest, bowing slightly to show his respect, and then said, Few women of the soft maple tribe are as generous and far-sighted as you are, Queen Luena of the House of Green. Just as you suggested, I shouldn't shed blood in advance before the great conquest that will prove the tradition of the soft maple people. Neither should I fight those who are my friends by instinct. Without waiting for anyone to reply to him, Grisus turned around and strode out of the council hall. One of the Green family's sworn guards followed behind him. One reason was to activate the silence magic circle, and the other was to monitor this person's words and actions. Not long after, this soft maple person loudly ordered his men to leave the hall. They must have responded immediately, because the sworn guards soon returned and nodded to indicate that they had left. After the 2 sworn guards closed the door of the council hall and concealed themselves, only Harriman, his father Green, and his mother Luena were left in the council hall. What do you think? Green rubbed his swollen forehead as he asked his only son. He had drunk too much wine today and heard too many drunken words from others. It depends on the standpoint. Harriman thought for a moment and gave the answer that was most in line with his heart. Emerald City doesn't need to start a plundering war now. No matter how much they flaunt their honor, it's the truth. For us, it's just a waste of lives and money. Even if we can become the winner in the end, when it comes to the distribution of wealth and land, we will incur the wrath of others. Moreover, is the 100,000 mountains of Emerald City very crowded? We don't even have enough people to go to that island to settle down. Seeing that Green didn't interrupt him, Harriman paused and said, "But if I were in the soft maple person's position, I would really be encouraged by Grice's lofty aspirations." What he said was very interesting. War would make everything scarce. For the soft maple people who had lived in the peninsula for decades, their power structure, social production, and population growth had all become saturated. War was not only an opportunity to prove honor and plunder land and wealth, it was also a good medicine to resolve internal conflicts and break the rigid balance. Of course, since it was a war, there were two possibilities of victory and defeat. That soft maple person is now looking for a guarantee. Even if he can't guarantee victory, he can't become the loser. This guarantee is best if it comes directly from the scales of Eternal Order or King's Landing City. But he doesn't have the ability to ask for it. That's why he first went a rope in the Yomishan people and then found us. After all, the ports of Red Pine City and Blue Maple City are too far from that island, and Black Willow City has no port at all. Harriman's analysis was indeed more in line with Green's expectations. The ruler of Emerald Wood City nodded in agreement. In fact, Green had never doubted his only son's ability and wisdom. When he was born, the name Harriman that Green had chosen for him actually contained expectations for him. Harriman really did receive the honor of Herad at the age of 20. In the Ramsey language, the word Herad meant pioneer. And in the University of King's Landing City, this word meant that among the students of 2 or even 3 years, their academic results and aptitude were the most outstanding, and they had the qualifications to open up a new vein of learning. Before Harriman, King's Landing City University had granted a total of 7 people the title of Herad. Those 7 people were now employed by the scale of Eternal Order to set up a course in King's Landing City University, and they independently led the students to undertake some research missions. Originally, this was an honor that Harriman had nailed on the board. On the other hand, Green had already mentally prepared himself to be the mayor of Emerald Wood City for a few more decades, and then hand over the family and the name of Green to Harriman. However, on the eve of his graduation from King's Landing City University, Harriman's graduation research ran into some problems. His research involved some taboos in the Ramsey Plain. This young master of the Green family, who had outstanding aptitude, had actually whimsically researched some matters related to the emperor. Without a doubt, after the contents of his research were leaked, Harriman immediately faced a series of restrictions and censures. If Green hadn't used his connections, his only son might have even been brought to the Judicial Bureau by the spies of the scales of Eternal Order to be locked up and interrogated under torture. Since then, although the title of Herad was not taken away, Harriman had no choice but to leave King's Landing City. The reason why Grimm had arranged for Hallamond to guard this hunting house for more than 2 years was because Grimm wanted to give an explanation to the secret spy department of the Scales of Eternity and prove that he had punished his only son. Secondly, he wanted Hallamond to be busy preparing for his coming-of-age ceremony in the Grimm family. Grimm wanted to use the test of hunting a hill giant or a similarly dangerous creature to let his only son put aside his research that was full of unknowns and could lead to fatal disasters. "I feel that you still have something to say to me." Green looked at his only son, who was still standing in front of him, and asked. "Indeed." Harriman nodded. "I want to go with that Graces, but it doesn't represent your decision. What you should be thinking about now is how to deal with the coming-of-age ceremony in at most 2 months, not." For the first time, Harriman interrupted his father's words. "I heard that there are tundra trolls on that island. I want to use them as hunting targets for my coming-of-age ceremony. After all, our Green family has killed too many hill giants over the generations. We should change our customs." Green snorted and said disdainfully, "Hunting an owl bear today almost cost you your life, and you still have the nerve to say anything else?" Harriman was somewhat helpless. He knew that the old warrior his father had arranged to be by his side must have reported today's situation to the person he was loyal to. That old man was once an oath guard, but because he was old, he took off his black armor. When questioned by the head of the family, even though he had taken care of Harriman since he was young, he would still tell the truth. Fortunately, Harriman had already thought of how to deal with it. As long as the target is difficult enough to deal with, every green has the right to decide their hunting target. This is the family's tradition. You just wanted to change the customs. Green retorted, changing customs doesn't mean forgetting the tradition. After saying this, Harriman didn't say anything else. He just slightly bowed and put one hand on his chest. After a while, Harriman looked at the tip of his boot for a long time. His father seemed to calm down his anger. I just said that I won't give that Graces a ship or a warrior. You want to go to that island to play? Fine, but you can't go against the order I just gave. I won't allow you to take away even one of my soldiers. In order to prevent no one from notifying me after your death, the old servant Weather will go out to sea with you. He doesn't know how to wield a sword, nor will he help you take care of your clothes. He is only a pair of eyes that I sent out. Chapter 1083. Because Grimm did not allow Harriman to take a warrior with him, Harriman could not choose from the soldiers stationed in the hunting hut. He knew that if he went to look for Graces, the soft maple would not want only his sword. Therefore, the young master of the Grimm family could only patiently return to the hall to drink with the others. Gurinder. Harriman first found the dwarf who was the supervisor of the family's mining pit and asked bluntly, "What have you been busy with recently? Are you willing to embark on a new adventure?" As he spoke, he tactfully handed over a small barrel. It was the Bergman brand dwarven beer that he had stolen from the underground wine cellar. The subterranean digger recognized the label on the barrel at a glance. Without saying a word, it took the barrel of Bergman beer, opened the lid, and drank to its heart's content. The best stuff from Old Bird's brewery. After drinking the beer, Gorlin used the back of his hand to wipe off the foam on his beard. He then used his fingers to pick up a piece of lamb rib and put it into his mouth. It was one of the essential first aid supplies in the dwarven mines. If there was an accident, a barrel of this nutritious beer would allow a dwarf to live for another week without needing to eat anything else. Harriman struck while the iron was hot. The Bergman brewery was destroyed in the fire. Since then, the Bergman brewery has been pursuing the goblin bandits who caused the disaster and has no intention of running a business. The brewery's cauldron has not been opened for more than 100 years. The Bergman brand beer that we have is either a fake or the 2,000 barrels stored in the basement of the legendary brewery. At that time, no one thought that the Bergman brewery would close the cauldron, and most of the beer that was sold was drunk on the same day. When I was researching the microbes in the sparkling drinks in King's Landing City, I bought 17 barrels of Bergman brand beer from the scale of Perpetual Order in 2 years. Excluding the barrel that was used during the research and the barrel that you're drinking now, I still have 15 barrels of Bergman beer in my collection. Seeing the gleam in the dwarf's eyes, Harriman knew he had won. If you can join me in this adventure, you can transport all 15 barrels of Bergman beer away with a mule cart in a month's time after deducting the normal commission. Galindo stroked his beard, put the half-empty beer barrel on the table, and extended his hand to Harriman. "Deal, human cub." Their palms collided, and Harriman felt as though he had just hit a rock. "But you have to remember, if you don't pay me enough, I might beat you up. But if you don't have Bergman, you're in big trouble. Trust me, you'll know what dwarf's fury is when the time comes." Just as he was about to continue popularizing dwarf's fury with Harriman, a pair of sinful palms quietly took away the barrel of Bergman beer that Galindo had just put on the table. A young gunner with a scar on his face, sitting beside Grinder, poured himself a mug of beer. He tilted his head back and downed the mug of beer stolen from the dwarves. "Hey, that's my beer." Galindo noticed the strange look in Harriman's eyes. Following the gaze of the Grimm, the dwarf saw the thief who stole the beer. However, what surprised Harriman was that even though the dwarf swiftly snatched back the barrel of beer and promptly stored it into his stomach, the dwarf didn't reach for his weapon from his back. Sharing is a virtue. The young gunslinger obviously wasn't good at drinking. It didn't show when he drank the low alcohol content honey wine, but after drinking the dwarven beer that had the same alcohol content as hard liquor, his face instantly flushed red like a ripe peach. Harriman nodded his head in greeting. It was obvious that the young gunslinger had a good relationship with Galindo. Generally speaking, there were only two possibilities to become close friends with a dwarf who was good at fighting. Either the dwarf was very good at drinking and was rich, often treating, or the dwarf had enough killing power to deserve the respect of the dwarf. The invitation I just gave to the subterranean digger is also suitable for the other guests in this hall. The premise is that you are willing, and you don't want me to give you more Bergman beer as payment. The young master of the Grimm family said wittily, and at the same time, he expressed his desire for the young gunslinger to join him on his adventure. Sure, I actually don't like drinking that much, the young gunslinger said as he let out a loud burp, which made the dwarf Galindo laugh. But my commission must be higher than this old man's. Even if it's a copper horn, it's fine. Otherwise, you better keep your mouth shut. Harriman laughed and shrugged his shoulders at the cursing dwarf, indicating that it was none of his business. Under the faint light of dawn, Harriman rode his horse in the direction of Greasus's ship. The clanging of the horse's hooves against the cobblestone road was synchronized with his heartbeat. The voice helped him push back his helplessness and frustration. If his father's farewell was another scolding, which he was already used to, then his farewell to his mother, Luwena, was a disaster. The tears in the woman's eyes were like a dose of medicine for regret. It made Harriman feel that he might have made the wrong decision last night. He kept urging his horse to speed up, as if the faster he ran, the more he could isolate himself from the past. The most important thing now was to move forward. He quickly reached the dock and found that Greasus's ship was still there, but it was almost ready to set sail. The dwarf Galindo and the young gunslinger Hugh Hood were already waiting for him. They stood on the dock, each carrying a heavy bag, which contained all the equipment they needed for this trip. Apart from them, there was also a tall old man standing by the pier. Due to his age, he appeared somewhat stooped. He was the only person Grimm had arranged to accompany Harriman on this trip. However, for as long as he could remember, Harriman did not like this old servant of his family named Weather. He always felt that this seemingly humble servant was hiding some unknown secret. Harriman. He turned his head to look at the ship. Greasus was standing on the deck, and the crew behind him raised the mast and fixed it in place. I heard that you wanted to go with me. Harriman walked closer, but did not board the ship. Yes, Lord Greasus. I have the intention to go with you. I admit that I am surprised to see you. Greasus nodded and said, After all, your father just offended me last night. I'm not like my father. Harriman replied in a manner that was neither servile nor overbearing. So, I will not apologize for him. Very well. No one needs to apologize for the mistakes of others. Everyone must be responsible for their own actions and honor. Greasus looked down at the dwarf, the young gunslinger, and old Weather. But you don't have your own ship, and you only brought 2 warriors from the Grimm family, and an old man who probably can't even hold a sword. We have swords. Harriman corrected him. However, these 2 are my adventurer companions, not soldiers of the Grimm family. Old Weather doesn't use a sword, so I will pay for his food, drink, and boat expenses. He is a servant my father sent to check on my words and deeds. Do you know how to use that sword? The leader of the soft maple changed the topic and looked down at the steel sword hanging from Harriman's waist. I have done sword training and hunted owlbears alone, but I have never used it to take the life of others. Is that enough? Greasus shrugged and said, It is. But before you kill, it is your turn to paddle. Don't misunderstand, Harriman. You may be a descendant of the Grimm family, but before you prove yourself, you cannot lead any warrior. I won't ask for more, Harriman said loudly. But don't misunderstand, Lord Greasus. One day, you will be afraid of the warriors who follow me. The soft maple laughed and waved for them to board the ship. I will wait for that day to come, just like I wait for moss to grow on a stone. Harriman jumped onto the deck of the ship from the dock, followed by Grinder and Hugh Hood. The 3 of them found a place on the deck at the bow and sat with the crew. Old Weather, on the other hand, stepped onto the ship on the trembling steps and found a place near the side of the ship to sit on the ground. Harriman observed the length of the ship. It had 16 oars on each side, and could be considered a medium-sized riverboat. The first batch of oarsmen sat on their stowage boxes, ready to receive the captain's orders to paddle. The helmsman stood on the starboard side of the ship, surrounded by a group of reserve oarsmen. They would take over after the first batch of oars had rowed 1,000 times. The lookout was already in position at the bow of the ship. After a while, under Greasus's orders, the ship untied the thick hemp ropes on the mooring posts. The captain stood near the mast and shouted orders to the boatmen at the side of the ship. These boatmen moved back and forth along the ship, untying the sealskin rigging and using long poles to push the ship away from the dock. Then, the oarsmen stuck their oars into the water, and the captain began to direct them to move the ship away from the dock into the deeper water in the center of the river, where the water splashed onto the deck of the ship. The oarsmen rowed the ship, first to the west and then to the south. They moved around the cliff where the hunting lodge was. Even though the ship left under the watchful eyes of the building, for the first time in his life, Harriman felt so far away from it. He felt a sense of freedom, even if it was only a little. At this thought, Harriman could not help but look at Old Weather, who was dozing off at the side of the ship. Chapter 1084. Perhaps it was because Grisus had poured a glass of expensive aged wine into the river before they left, so the journey from the mountainous area of Emeraldwood City to the estuary was very peaceful for most of the time. Moreover, due to the strong wind, the boat could sail at full sail, and an oarsman like Harriman only needed to rotate the oars a few times. But even such a simple movement still scraped the skin on Harriman's hand, straining the muscles on his arm, shoulder, and back. When he complained, the young gunner, Hugh Hood, told him that he had no idea of the true fury and brutality of the ocean. When a storm comes upon a ship, it will take the oars and the men beside you with it. The waves are like rolling mountains, twisting and breaking the boat like a wet rag. Harriman was skeptical of Hugh Hood's words. Previously, when he was in King's Landing City, he had rented an advanced steamboat with a few of his friends to go fishing a few times. The furthest he went was when he and his friends went out to sea for 2 days and 2 nights, all the way to the sea outside King's Landing City. There were still signal lighthouses established by the scale of perpetual order there, and the waves were not as terrifying as Hugh had said. However, he still enjoyed chatting with this gunner. He thought that he was an interesting person. This could be seen from the name Hugh Hood. This name in the Ramsey language meant huge head. Presumably, Hugh Hood had a huge head when he was young. Were you a big-headed kid when you were young? Harriman asked. Not bad. Anyway, my head wasn't small. Keyes, who had changed his name to Hugh Hood, replied indifferently. People with big heads are mostly smart, and at that time, there were too many siblings. With a big head and a big mouth, I had an advantage when fighting for food. Ha 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 ha. Keyes did not mind this at all. With a big head, he thought about many things and was usually open-minded. The captain of a ship was a fat man named Grove. He had a scar across his forehead, as if someone had tried to rip his skull open. When it came to the oarsman's turn to sit, he cursed and complained, and he was often strangely resentful when he had nothing to do. It was only on the afternoon of the first day of the voyage that he learned how to keep his mouth shut when he angered the bad-tempered dwarf Grinder. The captain also had a brother on the ship. He was an unusually tall man with a broad back and powerful shoulders. His temper didn't seem to be as bad as Grove's. His name was Ulfric, and he was only a navigator, but the rest of the crew seemed to obey him. Unlike the rest of the crew, Ulfric was not suspicious of Harriman, and when Harriman noticed his stare, he nodded in response rather than averted his eyes. That afternoon, he had been the first to pull away Grinder, who had been riding on his brother and punching him, and for that he had taken 2 heavy blows from the dwarf. But the good-tempered Ulfric didn't seem to mind. On the 6th day of the voyage, they reached the soft Acer Peninsula on the western coast of Ramsey, where they joined a fleet of more than 200 ships. The tide on the coast pushed the waves back into the grassy and reed-covered land, and then dragged the water back, carving out channels and exposing vast areas of sand and mud. Harriman had never seen such a scene before. Grices said that they would have to stay in this muddy sea for at least 3 days before they could board a large ship and cross the sea to Tapped Island, which was once occupied by the descendants of the Dwarven agent family, to begin their journey of conquest. Their ship wandered about in the deep water far from the coast until evening, when Grove, the captain, took advantage of the tide to bring the ship ashore and anchor with the rest of the fleet near the wet, dry land. When the tide receded again, the ship and the other galleys looked like whales stranded on a beach. The crew brought out boards strung together on hinges and stepped on them across the muddy shore. The boards were bent under the weight of the crew. Then they trudged through clumps of seaweed and across salt marshes where crabs and shellfish were buried. Proud storks roamed the land, plucking prey from the mud with their beaks before picking it up and eating it. However, these elegant big birds also had to be careful because there were also some mud crabs that were not smaller than them and were heavier than them living in this swamp. If they were not careful, it was unknown who would be whose food. The wind smelled of fish and salt, and when they set foot on solid ground, some of the ships were still not used to it. After all, they had stumbled across the rough waters for some time. "How long do you think we'll be here, Hood?" Harriman asked. His question was directed at the young gunner, while the bearded dwarf was leisurely drinking his beer. God knows how Grinder managed to bring the beer on board the ship. Although Halman did not see a single bottle of beer in the dwarf's bag, he seemed to be drinking it every day. It depends on when the lords arrive. Keyes, who had disguised himself as Hugh Hood, scratched the scar on his face. It was a scar that Keyes had accidentally left on his face when he killed Barzab, the Lord of Hell. He did not let it disappear, but kept it on his face as a constant reminder. Then he added to Harriman, "Also, the soft maple people will at least wait until the wind and waves become favorable before setting off." Harriman glanced back at the direction of the ships. The current situation at sea is quite favorable, so there should be no problem going out to sea. It's indeed advantageous to drive south. Quest's nostrils flared twice. But Tapped Island is west of the Ramsey continent. When they reached the edge of the tidal beach, the sand under their feet dried and turned white, and the drifting sand formed many sand dunes. The three of them climbed up the beach and came to a grassland high up. They found the fleet's camp here. They were spread over hundreds of acres of land, almost occupying their entire field of vision. The noise coming from the campsite was like thunder rumbling in the distance. Harriman, Grices, also came to the grassland from the beach. He motioned for Harriman to follow him. "Follow me." Harriman nodded in response. But before he left, the dwarf Grinder, the young gunner Hugh Hood, and the old servant Weather insisted on going with him in order to record the news of his death. An adventure doesn't just start with entering a battle. Taverns full of opportunities for brawls, banquet halls full of verbal sparring, and the king's palaces full of hidden dangers. These are all common starting points for an adventure. Quest used a stick tied with chicken skin to wipe the barrel of his spear as he introduced his past experience to Harriman in a serious manner. Harriman, who had the title of Harad, was a fast learner. After hearing Mr. Hugh Hood's long list of reasons, he decisively and humbly accepted it. Then, he and his companions followed Grices, who was walking in front, to a wide path. This path was between all kinds of camps and led directly to the core of the camp. Along the way, they saw blacksmiths working in makeshift blacksmiths, shipwrights taking inventory of wood, asphalt, and other supplies, tailors and weavers, merchants following the army with all kinds of goods, butchers in charge of slaughtering cattle and sheep, and bonfires gathered around them. The deeper they went, the thicker the atmosphere of life in the camp became. This place was like a moving town. Although in terms of scale, it was indeed not comparable to the settlements near King's Landing City or some of the villages in Emeraldwood City. But the variety of supplies and the people who made a living still gave Harriman a refreshing feeling. Harriman also noticed that when they passed by, many warriors patted their chests with their palms. Grices nodded in respect, and his arrival attracted the attention of many tents along the way. Of course, Grices also noticed this. They have never seen such a handsome young man before. Grices joked with Harriman. Perhaps it was because he was in his own territory the leader of the soft maple tribe, who was quite serious when he hunted in the big house in Emeraldwood City, spoke with a rare sense of humor. Maybe it's because he has seen too many ugly people like Grove. Harriman said seriously, not hesitating at all when it came to making fun of others. The dwarf, Grinder, who was walking beside him, laughed loudly. His laughter was like the sound of a horn, attracting the attention of many people. Grisus also smiled, but he still reminded Harriman in a low voice, "You still have to work with Grove for the time being." Harriman also had the same concern. It was not because of fear, but because he was worried about Groff. Grinder the dwarf had been complaining for the past 2 days, and the reason was that he had not exercised enough when he was beating people up a few days ago. Those who do not actively seek death usually live longer. Before Harriman could think of a reply, Hugh Hood interrupted and answered Grisus for him. He had just finished servicing his weapon and was carrying it on his back. Grisus looked at the young musketeer and saw that the latter was smiling and looking at him with a pair of clear eyes. The leader of the soft maple tribe did not know why, but he swallowed the reprimand that was about to come out of his mouth. Harriman took note of this. He first looked at Hugh Hood, then at Grinder the dwarf, and found that the corner of the dwarf's mouth was raised, as if he was trying hard not to laugh out loud. Well, this is also part of the adventure. Harriman now understood why Hugh Hood knew so many starting points for adventuring. Perhaps he had taken the initiative to discover them himself. They did not speak as they walked all the way to a rather large tent. This tent was built on a platform about a yard off the ground, made of wooden stakes and planks. At the entrance were 2 warriors in ringed armor, armed with spears, axes, and flintlocks. The 2 men recognized Grisus and bowed their heads in respect. But just as they were about to enter the tent, Harriman and the others were stopped by the guards. "Who is your companion?" "Mayor Grisus," one of the guards asked. The gaze of the other guard was focused on Harriman. He was already gripping his weapon, ready to fight at any moment. But he sincerely hoped that this would not happen. After all, there was a short and stocky dwarf in the group, wearing armor that was obviously made by dwarves, especially since they were only a few steps away from each other. "He is Harriman." Grisus put his hand on Harriman's shoulder. "He is the son of Lord Grimm of Emerald City." Beside him are his 2 adventurer companions, and an old servant sent by Lord Grimm as a scribe. His name is Weather. The 2 guards exchanged glances and then chose to let them pass. They lifted the felt of the door and walked into the tent. Near the center of the tent was a burning stove, and blue smoke slowly drifted towards the vent at the top of the tent. Harriman noticed some tapestries and carpets, which should have been purchased from the distant King's Landing city. An ornate folding screen made of fir would divided the interior of the tent into several small areas. There were 6 people sitting and standing by the stove. Some of them were holding gold-plated horn cups filled with ale. From the sweaters and rings they wore, these people were lords. "Grisus," one of them shouted, and, at the same time, clumsily walked from the other side of the tent. That person grabbed Grisus's shoulder. His beard and cheeks were red, and his voice was loud. It was obvious that he was the most powerful person in the tent. He was older than Grisus and most of the soft Acer people, and, judging from his size, he might not be an agile warrior, but he was very strong. His name is Rek, the council leader of the soft Acer people, and also the father-in-law of Grisus. Hearing Hugh Hood's voice in his ear, Harriman looked back at the young rifleman, who was talking in a low voice with Grindo. But it seemed that old Weather, who was standing beside him, and the others in the tent, did not hear their conversation. Naturally, there was no way to reprimand this somewhat rude behavior. "Ancestors bless you. You finally came back safely." Rex said, "How many ships did you bring us from Emeraldwood City?" Grisus shook his head and lowered his head. "Not a single one. In fact, it hurts me to say this." "No." The feudal lords who were drinking milk tea by the fire all looked over and asked. "Emeraldwood City's green has his own problems. In his territory, there's a group of Usanda warriors who colluded with the remnants of the lightning monk and the demonic fish. The latter should be a group of escaped slaves, but not only do they have a large number of people, but they're also good fighters. Mayor Green said that his soldiers are now busy cleaning up this group of criminals who are roaming around Emerald Wood City's territory. Chapter 1085. Since Grimm is short of manpower and money, he should join us to gain wealth on Tapped Island and make friends at the same time. The president of the Soft Maple Council, Rake, frowned and commented in an unfriendly tone. Grisis did not deny this, even though Harriman was standing behind him. I also mentioned this point, but I couldn't convince them except for one person. As he spoke, Grisis extended his thick index finger and pointed at Harriman. This is the son of Lord Grimm and Lady Luwena. His name is Harriman. A Grimm who hasn't experienced the adult trial? Otherwise, he wouldn't have called him by his family name. Rake lowered his head and looked at Harriman. Harriman opened his mouth with a wide smile, revealing his 2 rows of teeth. Obviously, this leader of the Soft Maple Council had some understanding of the local traditions of Emerald City and Ramsey, and was not as despicable and ignorant as his slovenly appearance suggested. He was a smart man. I'll complete the trial on Tapped Island. Harriman looked straight into Rake's eyes. I'm going to hunt a tundra troll. I'm not doubting your courage. Rake waved his hand. I'm just concerned. Harriman Grimson from Emerald City. How many people have you brought to us? When Rake mentioned the family name Grimson, he deliberately emphasized his tone. It sounded like he was not as generous and open-minded as he claimed to be. 2 adventurer partners and a clerk. Grisis answered Rake's and all the other Soft Maple Lords' questions on behalf of Harriman. The answer was worse than they had thought. Originally, they thought that Grimm was just unwilling to support them, even if it was just a ship. Now, it seemed that the Lord of Emerald City did not even send his son to guard them, so his attitude toward them was even more obvious. Rake's smile disappeared, and his eyes narrowed. I disobeyed my father and joined you. Harriman felt the atmosphere in the tent, so he added, so, I can't get anything from him. I can only do my best to bring the friends I can find and the equipment I need. The other lords stood there quietly, as silent as the pine trees in winter. At this time, Rake had just finished sizing up Harriman, and at the same time, he glanced at the dwarf Grinder and Keys, who had disguised himself as Hugh Hood. He gave you a sword that looks good. In the end, the Soft Maple Council leader found an excuse for the young Emerald City prince. Your 2 adventurer partners are passable. Grinder snorted coldly to express his attitude. From the dwarf's point of view, the human fat bastard who dared to criticize him was actually looking for a beating. If it weren't for Quest suppressing his impulse, the dwarf would have rushed up to give Rek an unforgettable lesson. This trip to Tapped Island is island. At most half a month is. After all, before you go back to Emerald City to get the Bergman brand beer, you can still come back here, Keys said softly in the dwarf's mind, but he did not fan the flames. Instead, it was as if he was stating a fact. Moreover, in terms of dwarves' lifespans, although the red-bearded Rake was the oldest human in the tent, Grinder did not call him a bastard on purpose. I will, Grinder said loudly. Dwarves never care to whisper, but he found that his words could not be heard by anyone other than Keys. I'll come back here to greet this human brat after this passable adventure is over. I'll test if his teeth are passable, and then let him experience the skills of the camp's doctors to see if they are passable. Keys laughed. Of course, other than Grinder, no one else noticed his strange behavior. He did not expect his dwarf friend to be so talkative. Anyway, we welcome you. After speaking to Harriman, Chairman Rector turned to the other Soft Maple Lords and said, since Grisis has returned, we should consider the matter of crossing the Sea of Light. He strode to the inside of the tent and sat on a stool. The stool creaked under his weight. The Yomians have set foot on the whale path 2 weeks before us. Their target is a large river in the middle of Tapped Island. There are many villages and towns on both sides of the river that they can raid to replenish their supplies and recruit local servants who are willing to earn money. If everything goes well, the Yomians will be able to take over that land before they join us. An old lord stood beside Rake. His hair was gray, and a short Ramsey short sword hung at his waist. The council president shouted at him, Old Burn, "Is there any news from your men intact?" When the old lord answered, Grisus leaned closer to Gelmont. "My men are stationed at the southwest corner of the camp," he said softly. "Go find them and have a good meal. You can also buy some weapons and equipment in the camp over the next 2 days." Harriman wanted to stay and learn more about the battle, but the dwarf Grinder urged him that it was time for dinner. So he nodded and left the meeting, leaving the tent with his 2 adventurers and the inseparable old weather. The sun had already set when they came outside. Dusk fell over the camp, and scattered campfires and torches illuminated the camp. They retraced their steps and headed west where they could see the sea. The sounds of revelry filled the air. It was obvious that the fanatical warriors could not wait for war and conquest. At the border of the camp, the sea of mud came into view. The bay was filled with the black silhouettes of ships waiting to depart. They turned south and wandered between the tents, observing the faces of the warriors as they tried to find someone they knew from Grice's ship. Finally, they found the navigator, Ulrich, sitting in front of a small campfire with more than 20 soft maple people around him. Following Grisus's instructions, the group of them also sat by the bonfire. As they warmed themselves, they prepared to share the fat sheep roasting above the fire. Keys and Grinder, who had better eyesight, could see that there were some oysters and mud crabs buried in the ashes under the campfire. They had been eating oatmeal mixed with dried fruit and oil for the past few days on the ship. Now that they were ashore, they had to eat something good to make up for their stomachs. Moreover, Grisus was probably the one who paid for the food. "Harriman!" A hoarse voice shouted from the other side of the crowd. Harriman turned around. He recognized the voice. "What is it, my captain?" The captain, Groff, walked over with a barrel of spirits. Since they had to eat crusted food and couldn't drink malt beer or honey wine, Grisus had him buy a barrel of hard cider for the warriors. He put the barrel of cider on the ground, opened the lid, and took out a corner cup. He reached in and dipped some cider into the cup to moisten his throat. "Tell me, can your people fight?" Groff didn't ask Grinder or Hugh Hood this question. He knew the answer a few days ago. Not only did the dwarf's answer leave a deep impression on him, his cheeks were swollen for 2 days because of it. "Why do you ask?" Harriman asked. "To be honest, I've never personally participated in a battle. However, it's said that it's because my father and grandfather were too good at fighting that Emerald Woods territory has always been peaceful." This answer was clearly not what Groff had expected. Facts spoke louder than words. Regions that were at peace all year round were mostly because the people there were good at fighting. Only a madman would want to fight a war they were sure to lose. He walked around the bonfire and stepped into the circle of soft maple people, but he didn't stop himself from saying something. "I just want to know what kind of person you are. We soft maple people don't accept weaklings." "That's enough, brother." Ulrich patted his brother's shoulder and pushed him to sit on the ground. Grinder led the way and laughed. The other soft maple people followed suit, not caring if Groff was in a daze. The little farce didn't last long. Soon, everyone's attention was drawn to the food. When the fat sheep was about to be roasted, Quest took out a bag and a small cup of honey from his body. Originally, the seasoning was just some salt, but Quest took out a bag and a small cup of honey. Under the shocked gazes of the soft maple people, he mixed chili powder, cumin, cloves, and other spices with honey and smeared it all over the lamb. How generous! Harriman gave his adventurer a thumbs up. The soft maple people, including Groff, responded with cheers. Those spices were expensive specialties of King's Landing. In many places in Ramsey, spices of the same quality were even more valuable than silver cats. "Well said, well said." Keys, who had disguised himself as Hugh Hood, waved his hand. "These were actually taken from the barbecue feast at the hunting lodge of your Grimm family. Your father, Lord Grimm, is the real rich man." Harriman didn't expect the spices to come from this way. He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. As the only son of the Grimm family, he didn't bring anything with him when he left home. Instead, he let Hugh Hood, an outsider, take a pouch of spices. Because of Key's generosity, he got a lamb leg for himself. Coupled with his quick hands and eyes, this seemingly young gunslinger was the first to pick out a mud crab from the ashes of the bonfire. As he chewed on the mutton, he skillfully used a small knife to pry open the crab's shell and ate the chewy crab meat inside. As he ate, he winked at Grinder from time to time, causing the dwarves who only got lamb ribs and a few grilled oysters to feel envious. Fortunately, he didn't take out a barrel of Bergman's dwarven beer from the wine cellar of the hunting lodge. Otherwise, Grinder's mentality would have exploded on the spot. After dinner, with the consent of the soft maple people, they used a few branches to start a bonfire and brought it back to their camp. They didn't have tents. Everyone, including the young master of the Grimm family, only had a sleeping bag sewn from sealskin. A layer of wool was stuck inside the sleeping bag with fish glue. It kept them warm, and most importantly, it was waterproof and moisture-proof. Some peat was added to the embers of the bonfire. As there were a lot of soft maple people in this camp, there was a shortage of firewood nearby. However, there was plenty of peat in the nearby swamps, and the price in the camp was much cheaper than firewood. Once the fire started, they all went into their sleeping bags to rest. Of course, even in the camp, there was still a need for someone to keep watch. Keyes took the initiative to take on this task, saying that he wasn't sleepy yet. In fact, it was true. After all, for a long period of time, the Megalosaurus spent its time in hibernation in order to increase its age. In fact, he didn't feel sleepy at all. The next day, Harriman was looking for merchants in the camp who sold shields. He didn't bring a shield when he left Emerald City. He spent the whole morning asking around, but there were no leads. The camp of the soft maple people was huge and messy. It wasn't until noon that he found a merchant who was willing to sell shields. Although the shield that the merchant provided had been used before, it was very sturdy. It was made from 2 layers of spruce wood. The leather around the edges was tightly sewn, and the iron hoop on the shield was oiled to prevent it from rusting. After haggling for a long time, Harriman finally bought the 2 shields for 1 silver cat and 12 copper debs. When he left, he passed by a few tents where women were trading their bodies for less than 1 silver cat. One of the women waved at him and called out to him. For a moment, her rosy cheeks made Harriman feel that she was very cute. However, he was now carrying 2 shields, 1 in each hand, and the only money pouch he had brought on this trip was at his waist. It would be difficult for this woman or her friends to steal it. Therefore, Harriman made the safest choice and continued to stride forward, heading straight back to the camp. It was definitely not because he only had theoretical knowledge and no practical experience that he was embarrassed by the encounter just now. After returning to the camp, Harriman gave one of the shields to the taciturn Old Weather. When we reach Tapped Island, you'll carry this shield. If my shield breaks, I will replace it with yours. In addition, you will have a higher chance of survival with this shield. After all, you still have to record my performance on this trip. Later, you will have to return to Emerald City to report to my father. Old Weather silently took the shield and did not refuse, just like how he had never refused Harriman's share of food and payment for the ship fare. However, Keyes saw all of this. He felt that Harriman had underestimated this old servant. This old acquaintance would not die so easily. However, Harriman was not to be blamed for being too young. In fact, Keyes had only recently recognized this old acquaintance. In a sense, this Old Weather was one of the first people he met when he first came to the Ramsey Plain. However, most of the things back then had already passed, and few of his old acquaintances were still alive today. Chapter 1086. Another day passed, and Harriman was learning from Grinder the dwarf how to better protect himself with a shield. But after a few hourglasses of practice, news came from the camp that the fleet was about to set sail. Then Grisus appeared in the crowd, bringing with him sweet honey wine. He formally ordered everyone to dip their fingers in the wine and flick it to the ground as a gesture of offering the beautiful nectar to their ancestors. He also ordered them to board the ships and prepare to invade Tapped Island. The fleet was very large, consisting of more than 200 ships, and could transport more than 10,000 warriors at a time. However, after seeing the giant steel ships anchored at the military port of King's Landing City from afar, Harriman still felt that they were a little shabby. After all, the fleet only had 7 steamships, and most of the other ships were only sail merchant ships or even the more backward galleys, like the ship that Hermund and the others were on. As for Grisus, like the other lords, he rode on a steamship made of steel, which was the lord's flagship. No wonder the captain of this ship is Grove, Hermund whispered to Hugh Hood as they rode. That lord has his own ship. The Blue Dragon, in the form of a young gunslinger, did not have any opinion on this. Not only did he have his own ship, even if all the ships of the Soft Maple tribe were added together, they would not be a fraction of his, but he did not care whether he took a ship or not when crossing the sea. The fleet sailed on the calm sea for 2 days, but on the third day, a storm came roaring from the north without warning. The roaring winds and ferocious waves scattered the fleet, and every ship had to fight for themselves. Captain Grove ordered the sails to be lowered to prevent them from being blown away by the wind, and every oarsman was rowing with all their might. Hermund had to row one moment and carry a bucket to get water the next, and so on until his legs and arms became as weak as soaked reeds. The storm, the rain, and the splashing waves irritated his eyes, causing him to be unable to see anything clearly. Even though it was daytime, he could only see the endless storm. Because he did not carry a timer and could not see the sun in the sky, Hermund was soon lost in the rhythmic sound of the oars, unable to tell how much time had passed. Fortunately, the galleon was a fine ship made of splicing and scale sheets. Furthermore, the bottom of the ship was laid with a sturdy keel and ribs. The sea-keeping ability was good, and it could move forward firmly in the rolling waves. Whether it was on the surging waves or in the middle of a sunken whirlpool, it was able to escape in the end. But sometimes, the waves and torrents would cause the ship to turn 180 degrees from the bow to the stern. Such a large rotation would naturally cause cracks in the ship's deck, causing water to enter the ship. At that time, there was no way to boil pitch for repairs, so the crew had to use hardwood cloth to plug the leaks in various parts of the ship. Hermund came to help, and soon he learned the trick. But every time they repaired a new ship, 2 new places to enter the ship. In the end, the deck of the ship seemed to grow a woolen carpet. Captain Groff complained loudly. "It's all because of you people from Emeraldwood City that our ancestors did not bless us." Following the captain's provocative words, Hermund noticed the strange looks in the eyes of the surrounding crew. "Be careful, Hood." Holding a piece of tar wool, Hermund reminded the young gunner in a low voice as he passed by him. In this weather, a musket is not as useful as a sword. Keyes only shrugged his shoulders, seemingly unmoved. Hermund then looked at Grindur. The dwarf had taken down the huge hooked axe from his back and stood firmly on the deck with the axe in his hands. The surrounding crew members were somewhat afraid of this brave dwarf. Obviously, no one wanted to be chopped into pieces before drowning. As for Old Weather, Hermund was unable to find him at first. The young master of the Green family had thought that the old servant might have fallen into the sea and drowned in the storm. It took him a while to scan the entire deck with his eyes before he finally saw the shield that he had bought with money. It stood like the cover of an umbrella among the casks of provisions which were placed under the mast. "That old man sure knows how to take care of himself," Hermund muttered. However, things did not progress to the worst. While the process was dangerous, no one on the ship drowned or was chopped into pieces by the axe. Ulfric, who was rather reputable among the crew, stood up and took charge of the situation. He stopped his brother Groff from complaining and took out a lamb from the captain's cabin. He even took out his wallet and threw all the lambs into the raging sea as a sacrifice to his ancestors. The spirits of the ancestors who are willing to bless their descendants will not ask for more, he announced with an unquestionable tone, boosting the morale of the crew. If they still want more, then they can't be the ancestors of the Soft Maple people. Perhaps it was because what he said made sense. Anyway, after the sacrifice, the storm gradually subsided. When the rain stopped and the weather cleared up, the crew cheered. Then, under Groff and Ulfric's orders, they used a special iron pot and carefully stored dry wood to boil the pitch. As the navigator, Ulfric had already identified the weather and location. After the storm, they would have 2 sunny days. After patching the ship with ironclad, wooden planks, and pitch, they could use the time to let the pitch dry. Apart from that, there was also good news. After the storm, There was an easterly wind. They could set up the sails and sail with the wind, while the oarsmen could get plenty of rest during this time. Another 3 days passed in this manner. When Harriman woke up again, he suddenly heard the cry of a tern. At first, he thought he had returned to the Ramsey continent, but he soon realized that they were on the other side of the sea. After 6 days of sailing, the ship finally arrived near Tapped Island on the morning of the 7th day. Around the ship, the fleet that had scattered due to the storm gathered once more. The warriors ate hard bread, bacon, cheese, nuts, and thick porridge that had just been cooked. That was why the terns were attracted by the smell of food and woke up the other crew members like Harriman, who had just woken up. Just like when they landed on the peninsula where the soft maple people lived, Tapped Island faced a mudflat. The mudflat stretched several miles to the north and south, and to the west was a salt marsh that spanned hundreds of acres. Standing on the mudflat, one could see the edge of the marsh. That should be where the soft maple people's new camp was. According to the original plan, the fleet would sail upstream from a large river in the middle of Tapped and attack the villages and towns along the coast. They would also meet up with the Yamshan army coming south from the north. However, after the storm, the lords of the soft maple people felt that it was a good idea to rest here for a while. After all, their army was here to conquer this land and plunder wealth, not to squander the lives of their warriors for the sake of the lords' arrogance. At this moment, the lords did not restrain the army and allowed them to assemble on their own. The steam-powered ships that had a deeper draft had sailed a few miles to the south and docked in a fjord, worried that they would run aground. The lords and their personal guards rode on magic carpets that were engraved with the Tansen floating disc spell. They carried their weapons and equipment and crossed the marsh to find a suitable place for the army to set up camp. The crew members who disembarked from the anchored merchant ships and galleys had to personally open up a path to the camp in the marsh. After that, the lords would listen to the captain's reports and choose the easiest path to build a path that met Ramsey's standards and connected the camp to the wharf. The air in Tapped was warm and humid. Harriman's boots sank into the mud as soon as he landed. Some of the waters here were shallow, and the crew could cross on foot. However, the rest of the swamp looked deep and dangerous, and they would have to spend a lot of time and energy to bypass them. Leading the way was Hugh Hood, a quick and sturdy musketeer who was constantly describing the dangers of the marshes to the crew who followed him. Even if we know the shortcut here, we have to be careful to cross the swamp ahead. We'll have to spend at least 2 hourglasses worth of time, Quess, who had assumed the name of Hugh Hood, said as he adjusted his direction again. He walked a few hundred steps to the north of the swamp and approached a flowing river. The river was wider and flowed more slowly. This meant that the river had been formed for some years, and the land around it should be thicker. If they were lucky, they could follow the river and cross the marsh. The deeper they went into the marsh, the heavier the air they breathed. It was full of biting mosquitoes and flies. All around them were tall grasses, reeds, and poplar trees. There were also short shrubs that filled the labyrinth of brackish wetlands, shrouded in a layer of mist that seemed to never disperse. Many of the crew members were getting thirsty and wanted to stop to find water that they thought was clean. However, Keyes did not have to say anything. Ulfric and Grove would walk up to them and give them a slap on the back of the head. "If you want to die, don't do it now," the navigator reprimanded. He was more than 2 feet taller than the crew member who tried to scoop water for a drink, so he was quite intimidating. Drowning in your own waste is one of the most tragic ways to die. If you want to try, I won't stop you next time. When the sun reached the top of the trees, they finally smelled burning wood, but it was the smell of burnt smoke. The river before them widened, blackened by ash and polluted by death. There was a corpse in the reeds. It was a man. He floated on the water, and while he attracted a lot of flies, he probably had not been dead for long. The stench of the corpse was not obvious, and the body was not too swollen either. As they walked along the embankment, the crew found a second and third corpse. Not long after, they found a few more corpses. They were all men in linen clothes. Their bodies were either torn apart, cut open, or dismembered. Harriman had never seen such a death before. Old age disease, and accidents had taken the lives of some people he knew, but he had never seen the death of looting and war. Even though he was prepared to kill a few of the Dwarf Island's proxy warriors when he left the hunting house, he hadn't killed anyone yet, nor had he seen anyone lose their life to such a violent act. In particular, from the way the deceased were dressed, they did not look like warriors at all. Instead, they looked more like honest farmers. It should be a group of goose shepherds. Keyes' voice rang in the ears of the grim family young master. Only then did Harriman notice that the musketeer he called Brother Big Head had stopped in his tracks. His face was expressionless as he patted the frowning Grinder with his palm. The dwarf seemed unhappy as he took off his wineskin and gulped down 2 mouthfuls of ale. The people who were killed were not warriors. Those who came first did not deserve the glory, Grinder said in Dwarvish. Kith didn't help him this time, because other than him and Harriman, the other soft maple dwarves couldn't understand the dwarven language, which was as hard as stone. The soft maple people did not come here for glory. Land and wealth are their true goals. Keyes also spoke to Grinder in Dwarvish, just like how you can never wake a person who is pretending to be asleep. Similarly, you can't teach those who treat vanity as a sense of honor how to distinguish the difference between the two. Seeing the other crew members looking at him with pride, Keyes smiled at them and continued to walk upstream. When they walked out of the swamp, they saw a small island surrounded by a river and a swamp. The place was filled with trees and was surrounded by nets and wooden fences. There were a few thatched huts with mud walls inside the fences. A causeway made of wooden planks connected the island to the river bank and the swamp in the distance. The smell of burnt wood that they had smelled earlier came from that place. As they got closer, they also smelled a strong smell of bird feces. Just like what Keyes said, the corpses they saw were the goose shepherds who were herding geese on the beach. When the vanguard of the soft maple tribe arrived, they immediately took over the goose field and started a massacre. Because they were worried that the goose shepherds would leak the news, the soft maple lord led his personal guards to kill them all and threw them into the river. Chapter 1087. The goose farm was huge and the food was readily available. Perhaps because they didn't want to smell the bird poop, the nobles who'd taken over the area didn't set up their tents in the area that was surrounded by water on 3 sides. Instead, they walked another half a kilometer inland. As one of the first waves of people to arrive, Groff and his brother Ulfric declared that they had the right to occupy one of the goose herders' huts according to the rules of the soft maple people. The other soft maple people who arrived one after another had no objections. During lunch, the young gunslinger Hugh Hood walked in the shed and caught 7 or 8 fat geese before breaking their necks. First, he roughly stripped them of their fur, then went to the upstream of the nearby stream to clean them one by one. Finally, he used a thin rope made of straw to tie their ankles one by one, and carried these ingredients back to the camp. The crew had already started a fire with the firewood they gathered. Hugh had roasted the geese over the fire. Not long after, the smell of roasted meat mixed with the smell of burning feathers and filled the yard outside the hut. The other soft maple people who'd managed to get a hut also chose to eat their lunch that way. Throughout the afternoon and evening, many people came to the goose field one after another. Some people chose to set up camp here, while others went a little further and settled in a place closer to the Lord's camp. The next morning, the nobles sent their retainers to find the captains. Grove had a few words with the man and reported the situation of his ship and the route they'd taken when they landed. After the Lord's squire left, Grove and Ulfric brought some more food and followed the path back to the beach to visit the remaining crew members. After about 3 hourglasses, the 2 brothers returned together. Many people had already gathered near the goose farm. Even their lord, Grisus, had come. The road which Hugh Hood had led them along, being close enough and bordering on a small river, had been chosen as the official road by the lords of the realm. What was truly unexpected was that Grisus had handed this matter over to Harriman. He's a top student of King's Landing University, the youngest person to receive the title of Herad. The elected mayor of Acer explained to everyone. Although few people, including Grisus, truly understood the true meaning of the title Herad, The people of Soft Maple must have heard of King's Landing, and they all felt that the scholars in the first city of Ramsey must be the most knowledgeable. Therefore, even Grove, who had doubted Harriman's courage many times on the ship, had no objections this time. After receiving the appointment, Halliman did not immediately direct the people to work. First, he took out a charcoal pencil and a few pieces of paper from his bag. It didn't take long for him to fill the paper with lines of words and numbers. Other than Keyes, who had disguised himself as Hugh Hood, who stood behind him and watched with great interest, the others had no concept of the mathematical formulas that Harriman had written. After the calculations, Harriman ordered the dispatched Soft Maple people to chop down some newly grown trees and sharpen the trunks into long wooden stakes. Following that, he mobilized everyone to dig for clay nearby, collect pebbles and gravel, and categorize them according to a few sizes. Because the categorization did not require much manpower, Harriman led the remaining laborers to make some tools such as road hammers, wooden hammers, wheelbarrows, and so on. Before leaving at night, he ordered people to find a few small boats and place the wooden stakes on the boats to go downstream. Every once in a while, he would personally disembark and hammer the wooden stakes into the embankment. Then, he would use bark and thatch ropes to tie them together. Because the length of each rope was roughly the same, the distance between the wooden stakes was actually similar. After completing this task, he was the last to return to rest. However, he did not rest in the camp, but near the piles of clay, pebbles, and gravel, guarding the site by himself. When the sun rose again, Harriman divided the Soft Maple people into several teams, according to the number of wooden stakes. Each team was led by the most prestigious person. First, he ordered the team leaders to use large sickles and axes to chop down all the reeds and trees in the areas they were in charge of. Then, he dug out a fire belt near the salt marsh. Next, Harriman ordered people to bring oil and torches to burn all the cut-down vegetation to ashes. The ashes were not cleaned up, but used as the first layer of the foundation. The smallest pebbles were laid and mixed together. Moreover, each team was assigned a large wooden hammer with several ropes tied to it and a flattened bottom. The Soft Maple men used this tool to hammer away at the layer of cover to make the ash and pebbles bond more tightly. Then, using the small wooden boats as transportation, Harriman sent boatloads of clay to each section of the road that was under construction. He instructed the Soft Maple people to use water and mud to build a wedge-shaped roadbed on both sides of the road. When they finished this task, the 3 accompanying mages from the Lord's camp rushed over. Harriman had already calculated the time and sent someone to invite them to the Lord's camp. The 3 of them had already filled up their spell slots with mud to stone yesterday. Depending on their abilities, each of them cast 7 or 8 spells to a dozen spells, which happened to cover the entire half-kilometer-long road and build a stone ramp for the convenience of the drainage of the road. The following work was much simpler. Harriman led his men to layer the pebbles they collected yesterday into the road. The lower layer was filled with small pebbles, while the upper layer was filled with large pebbles. Following the laying, the workers would also sprinkle gravel into the gaps between the pebbles. This way, the road would become more compact and thicker, and also ensure that the road would not accumulate water during heavy rains. Finally, they sprinkled some clay powder into the top layer of pebbles, and once again hammered the road with the wooden hammer. In a little more than a day, Harriman led his men to pave a road across the swamps by the shore. Next, he led the workers to use the remaining wood to build a pier deep into the sea by the shore before it got dark. A ship like Grove's galleon could be moored at this pier and would not run aground even when the tide was low. The remaining wheelbarrows from the construction were also left here, providing great convenience for the crew who were about to unload supplies from the ship. Even Grinder had to admit that Harriman, this human brat, had a unique talent in engineering. He could even be compared to the slightly more experienced dwarven builders. Of course, in terms of quality, the dwarves did not think highly of this hastily built road. If a team of mountain giants or dwarven heavy vehicles were to make a trip here, this road would basically be destroyed. Compared to the dwarven roads, the quality of this road is much worse. Of course, he also admitted, using the soft maple people's construction team and poor materials, Harriman's road is still considered passable. Chapter 1088. Due to his contribution in building the road, Harriman was not the only one who was rewarded. All the soft maple people who participated in the work were rewarded as well. Their money pouches were filled with a large number of copper debentures, while Harriman had an extra 5 silver cats. With this money, he bought from the quartermaster enough honey bread, blue cheese, fried nuts, and fresh fruit, and ribs of freshly butchered and cut-up beef, enough for a shipload of men. Because of his actions, the crew members who were prejudiced against him because they shared a common enemy with Captain Grove changed their views of the young master of the Green family. However, Harriman had already shown his skills and became busy. The lords of the soft maple tribe announced that they would be resting in this place for a week. Now that there were 5 days left, they gave Harriman one new task after another. Gradually, a group of low wooden houses and tall stone castles appeared at the landing site. Although this was due to Harriman's planning, it was also due to the contributions of the military mages. The wharf that was first built was being renovated and expanded almost every day. Many merchants from the soft maple people's territory also arrived. Ships came and went, carrying merchants and goods like busy bees in a hive. Old Weather had to follow Harriman around every day because he had to fulfill his promise to Grim. Among them, only Grinder and Keys were Harriman's adventurers, so they were not obligated to follow him everywhere. Unlike the dwarves who drank and ate every day and relied on fighting with some soft maple warriors to exercise their bodies, Kith preferred to wander around the camp alone. Walking on the streets of this city, which had yet to be named, the young gunner named Hugh Hood saw merchants and goods from all over the Ramsey Plain. There were even small, remote countries whose languages and names he had never heard of before. He drank the grape wine shipped from Lanfeng City and bought himself an expensive off-road bicycle manufactured in King's Landing City. This was the only bicycle sold in the entire camp. He tasted the olive oil from Red Pine City and bought some spices and dried fruits and vegetables from the scales of Perpetual Order. He even played a few dice games with some people and a few rounds of Heroes Chess with some prizes. After the merchants calculated the silver cats he gave them, they would sometimes use special small silver coins to make change because they did not have enough copper and did not want to cut the fine silver coins. These coins were printed with curling runes that looked like vines. Keys recognized that these runes were derived from the common gnomish inscriptions. They were probably the local currency of Tapped Island. From this, it could be seen that this group of merchants either came from the north of the island, where the Yamshans who had conquered a part of Tapped should have the coins in their hands. Or, these merchants might have been here long ago, and their previous customers were most likely the descendants of the families that had once represented Dwarf Island. Keys was not surprised by this. It was the nature of merchants to pursue profits. Moreover, some of the goods sold by these merchants might have been wholesale from King's Landing City or the scale of Perpetual Order. Although Tapped Island was the residence of many felons in the eyes of the Ramseys, weren't they also Ramsey's humans? They were no different from the people living on the Ramsey continent. Keys had read some of the internal reference documents of the scales of Perpetual Order. The Chamber of Commerce was not inclined to use force to suppress and enslave the families who had acted as agents of Dwarf Island and their affiliated families, as well as the many freedmen who had followed them here. On the contrary, the think tank of the Chamber of Commerce believed that the more than 700,000 people living here might become a relatively large consumer market in the future, and they could trade with them. Apart from the possibility that they had come here spontaneously, the merchants of the Soft Maple Peninsula might have come to Tapped Island to sell their goods at the behest of the lords. If they wanted to go on an expedition to the island, they could not avoid gathering information. The lords of the Soft Maple Peninsula could not possibly have so many professional spies as the lords of the scale of Perpetual Order. Therefore, these merchants who came here to do business became the best candidates to carry out tasks such as spying on the various forces and drawing maps of the island. Moreover, Through trading activities, they could also learn about the resources of Tapped Island and the wealth gap between different regions. For the expeditionary army of the Soft Maple Peninsula, who came here to do business, this information was an indispensable and valuable asset. The lords could also use this information to make more informed decisions. Of course, using peddlers instead of professional spies to obtain information was actually a double-edged sword. The lords could not meet every merchant who came here to do business, and the spellcasters who served the lords could not cast lie detection on everyone. It was entirely possible that the merchants would submit information to the various lords of the Soft Maple Peninsula to receive rewards. When they came here, they would also sell information about the other side to the leaders of the various forces on Tapped Island in exchange for rewards. On the 5th day of Key's stroll in the gradually emerging town on the bicycle, he had just finished his lunch of oatcakes, cream of mushroom soup, and roasted wild boar meat in a newly built wine house. Suddenly, there was a commotion in the distance. There were shouts of humans, neighing of horses, and barking of dogs. All of them were mixed together. A two-wheeled carriage galloped from the woods outside the camp. It was completely out of control, and the pedestrians in the camp were so frightened that they scattered like birds and beasts. The coachman pulled the reins with all his might and put down all his weight to stop the carriage. "First aid," the coachman shouted, trying his best to calm the two frightened horses. Then, the coachman carried a man with a sallow face down from the back of the flatbed carriage. A faint scar ran across the man's forehead, as if his skull was about to be cracked open. The man was also wearing a red scarf around his neck, indicating that he was the captain of a merchant ship. The coachman was very strong. He carried the man on his shoulder and ran toward the medical tent in the camp. Obviously, he knew where to seek help. However, when he passed by the door of the izakaya, he saw that the patient's eye sockets were slightly sunken and emitted a kind of purplish-green color. Quest knew that this person was most likely beyond saving, unless this person could ask the mages who serve the Lord to cast greater detoxification or life-sharing on him. The former required a higher level of skill for the spellcaster, and the mages who followed the army probably could not cast it. The latter would permanently damage a part of the spellcaster's health. Although this damage was theoretically not directly related to one's lifespan, the weakening of the body's various functions would normally shorten one's lifespan. If the mages were not related to this person, they would certainly not be willing to pay such a price. In the afternoon of the same day, Harriman was once again summoned by Greasus. Together with his two adventurer companions, Keys and Grisus, as well as his clerk, the old servant Weather, the three of them were brought to a newly erected manor. The building was rectangular in shape, about 50 yards long and half as wide. It was surrounded by a 20-foot-high stone wall, which was as thick as an adult's shoulder. The wall was first built by driving wooden stakes into the ground, then piling up mud to form a prototype. Finally, the mages cast the mud-to-stone spell to shape the wall into a solid shape. On top of the wall, there were wedge-shaped shooting holes arranged at intervals. The hall in the middle of the building was not only used as a meeting room, but could also store food, wine, and various weapons. When necessary, it could accommodate the Lord's personal guards. The whole building was like a small fortress. It took about 400 men to build it in 2 days. There were 6 other similar fortresses, all belonging to the lords of the Soft Maple people. They were all connected by zip lines. If the situation was at its worst, and the Soft Maple people had to board the ships and withdraw from Tapped Island, these forts could be nailed into the area like nails. They could block the retreating Soft Maple people from the army that might appear and pursue them. Because this mansion was designed by Harriman, he wasn't unfamiliar with the twisting corridors that were used for military purposes. Without needing anyone to lead the way, he brought his 3 companions to the Lord's Hall. Grisus was already waiting for him. The nominal mayor of the Soft Maple people sat on his own throne. In addition to the guards on duty, there was a stretcher covered with white cloth on the floor of the hall, and a man with a sorrowful and indignant expression standing beside the stretcher. "I need your knowledge and wisdom." Grisus went straight to the point after seeing Harriman. After landing, We sent several scouts disguised as caravans to the nearby towns to collect information. But in the end, only 2 of them returned to the camp alive, and now there's only 1 warrior left. As he spoke, Grissus gently picked up the crown on his head and then put it down again. This was a sign of respect to the person standing in the middle of the hall. As soon as Keys entered the hall, he recognized the man as the coachman who carried the man in the camp. The man immediately placed 1 hand on his chest and bowed 90 degrees, returning the courtesy to Grissus. The warrior lying on the ground was not killed by swords, arrows, or bullets. Grissus stood up while holding onto the 2 handles of his seat and said loudly he was overtaken by someone on his way back and was killed by a poisoned blow dart. Life and death are decreed by fate, especially in war. No one can ask for too much. However, the warrior who returned told me that the person who pursued them was most likely not a person. If I didn't get drunk from drinking too much, that's what you would have said. The soft maple overlord looked at his subordinate, who immediately understood and said, "That's right, my lord. According to our intelligence, the pursuer we encountered was a warrior belonging to the comely family of Tapped Island. Just 1 person. Logically speaking, my team has a total of 7 members, including me, so it shouldn't be difficult to kill 1 person. But in the battle, that person was abnormally agile and powerful. It was as if he was wearing the sky-high fanatic armor from King's Landing City. However, that person was not wearing the advanced kinetic exoskeleton armor. Because we injured him during the battle, we found that the guy's body was embedded with many strange metal parts. He's like the kind of modified human mentioned in the intelligence." Grissus raised his hand and interrupted him. The overlord did not want the others present to know too much about the information he had and the source of the information. It was enough for them to know the term cyborg. Chapter 1089. Of course, Grissus did not withhold any information. Doing so would be too much, and he would be suspected of sending the young master of the Grimm family to his death in vain. He gave Harriman a burn after reading scroll. There was another spell on it that guaranteed that the scroll could only be read by 1 person. Petty to the point of cowardice, Grissus mumbled. Ever since he saw the corpses of the goose shepherds, the dwarf had become more and more disgusted with the way the soft maple people acted. However, because Keys was standing beside him, his words were still not heard by the others. Quest looked at him in the eye, as if he agreed with what Quest said. "This is some information I know about the modified humans," Grissus said to Harriman. "You are Halid of King's Landing University, so you should be able to understand some things. My magic consultant told me that the Taps use some taboo technology to create those things." The soft maple mayor paused, as if he was considering his words carefully. This was not a common situation for him. The spell consultant said that not only did they use some mechanical technology from Dwarf Island, they might even have borrowed from the strange spells used by the Dark Emperor when he created the Calamity Generals. This inference is not optimistic, especially since we don't know how many of those modified humans they have. Therefore, I order you to lead a team to find traces of the modified humans, capture them, and study them, so that we can learn more about these weapons of war. I hope you can use the knowledge you learned in King's Landing to discover their weaknesses. Harriman accepted Grissus' order. He saw it as part of his adventure. However, Grissus laughed at him. Perhaps a human child like you who is participating in a war for the first time can't tell the difference between war and adventure. This time, Keys did not block the dwarf's words and allowed Harriman to hear them. However, he did not know how Harriman would think about this matter. The crescent moon in the sky shone with silver light, allowing them to see the pale road paved with gravel, but not enough to determine if there were any threats lurking in the shadows under the trees beside the road. However, they were not afraid of the bandits, because the bandits probably would not expect travelers to pass by here, and it was unlikely that they would try to attack such a heavily armed group. However, the group still kept their eyes wide open and their ears pricked up as they moved forward. About midnight, they entered a low-lying area of scrub and swamp, surrounded by a forest of oak, birch, hazel, and hornbeam. Under the cover of the leaves, the path ahead was dark. It was definitely impossible to proceed safely. Considering that they were already dozens of miles away from the landing camp, Harriman decided to spend the night here. They left the narrow road for some distance and came to a place where there were 3 great oaks, each longer than the width of one's arms. They rested among the twisted roots on the side of the trunk that faced away from the road and took turns keeping watch. They could not see the road from where they lay, but that meant that they could not be seen by anyone on the road. Harriman had brought some ropes, which he tied to the trunk of a tree to form a support. He then spread some dry branches on which he made beds for several people. When he was in college, he had participated in several camping activities, so he knew how to keep himself away from the damp ground. He had to admit that this was a wise choice. Even the dwarf Grinder liked this hammock because it was warm and comfortable to sleep on. Before a battle broke out, it was necessary to conserve every ounce of energy. Because of this, other than the small trick of building a hammock, Harriman specially asked Grisus for a horse as a means of transportation. However, as a dwarf, Grinder did not like to ride, and Keys, who had disguised himself as Hugh Hood, had bought a wide-tire off-road moped from King's Landing City from a merchant 2 days ago. There was a metal rear seat on which Grinder the dwarf could sit and hitch a ride. Therefore, in the end, the only ones who had horses were Harriman and his clerk, Old Weather. Although he was a little dissatisfied that these 2 horses had taken half of the silver cats he had earned from his 5 days of hard work, Harriman was actually quite fond of his own steed. It was a mixed-blood soft maple horse, with some of the blood of Lawn Maple City's military horses flowing in its veins. Although it was not tall, it had great strength and astonishing endurance, and its adaptability and intelligence were also very good. It had a shiny chestnut coat, a straw-colored mane, and a white spot between its eyebrows. For some reason, Hugh had named it Carrot when he saw it. What was even stranger was that the horse seemed to accept this strange name. On the road, every time the young musketeer rode past it and called it Carrot, the horse would slow down and tilt its head in response. During a meal, Keys even took a few compressed oatmeal biscuits from the grain bag that Carrot carried for him and tasted them. As this was warhorse feed from Lord Grisus's personal guards, the taste was actually not bad. Some salt was added to it, and both humans and horses could replenish their salt. Carrot was initially unhappy about this, but after Keys took out a few pieces of licorice candy and fed it, the smart warhorse did not mind. But every time it stopped to rest, it would always glance at the satchel on Keys's bicycle. It was an uneventful night. Harriman was on duty as the last sentry before dawn. Thus, when everyone woke up feeling refreshed, this young master of the Green Clan was somewhat exhausted. He rinsed his mouth with water mixed with an energy potion from his water skin and ate breakfast. His tiredness gradually disappeared. Before the sun had completely risen, the group of people set off again. Not long after, the scenery in front of them gradually widened. The lazy sun rose above the ruins of a town, and the path under their feet led them there. Although this city was not small even when compared to the scale of the Ramsey continent, and it left a deep impression, its broken walls and buildings made it look deserted even when the sun shone on it, as if it was the residence of the dead. This is the result of war. Although Harriman wisely chose to go around the ruins instead of through it, when he saw the broken stone pillars, collapsed roofs, wooden pillars with marks of sharp weapons, and traces of fire covered by vines and moss, he could see the reason for the town's abandonment. Presumably, somewhere in the surroundings or in the ruins, there might be some graves that could no longer be seen. Before the Yomians and the soft maple people came together, the residents of Tapped Island might not have had the right to enjoy a stable and peaceful life, Sui Xiong said. Keys, who had disguised himself as Hugh Hood, had one foot on the ground and the other on the pedals of the off-road bicycle, feeling a little emotional. When people interact with each other, jealousy or other negative emotions will always be born. This is almost unavoidable, and these negative feelings can provoke conflict and lead to war. After the event, no matter how high-sounding the words are, war has nothing to do with the word honor. They soon left the ruins, and at noon, they came to a Saxon town. They passed by fields and farms, and then a few houses at the edge of the town. Up ahead, Gelman saw a crossroad in the center of the town, where several buildings were arranged closely together. There were places that looked like cold bread houses and malt taverns, as well as many empty market stalls. He saw that there were almost no Saxons around, as if they had all gone into hiding. But then, a man came up to them and raised his hand to stop them. The man was less than 6 feet tall, but his shoulders were broad and his arms were thick. A waist-length dogskin vest clung to his chest, and there might be metal pieces embedded in it. It should be a leather cloth armor. He had a war club and a long steel dagger on his belt, buckskin tights, and a pair of leather boots on his feet. More impressively, his hair was shaved in an intricate labyrinth pattern from one temple to the other, and his bare arms under his half-sleeve linen shirt were covered with tattoos of strange swirls and hooks, which only Kith recognized as an artistically modified version of Gnomish script. His face was thin and angular, and because he had a full beard, it was hard to tell his age. But under the furrowed brows, his hostile brown eyes showed that he had been through a lot. If the adventurers were not mistaken, this man had been through many battles. Catelyn has finally become peaceful. This warrior stood in front of Haramond and his companions. His eyes looked past Haramond, who was holding Radish, and stared at Haramond and his companions. "What brings you guys here? There's nothing you want here. Whether you're here to ask for money or to recruit soldiers, the peaceful place of Catelyn will not welcome you." From a scroll that Grysis gave him, Halamund knew some relevant information. He knew that this town was called Catelyn. It was a settlement that appeared after a civil war on Tapped Island. Most of the residents here were survivors of the defeated towns. Now, they grew beans and wheat to make a living. However, this land, for some reason, did not have a new governor, so the local people could only govern it themselves. The warrior who stood in front of them was probably the lawn narrator, who was chosen by the local residents as described in the scroll. "We're traveling north." Halamund noticed that there were 3 people standing nearby. They were all armed, and one of them even had a longbow in his hand. "We don't plan to stay here, and we don't plan to disturb the peace here. We're just passing by." "Then where did you come from? Fullerford or Oningen Avenue?" The lawn narrator shrugged. "Although it's not my job to know who comes and goes, and where they come from and where they're going. But since travelers often bring trouble and disputes, it's my habit to ask more questions." When he said the last sentence, his eyes narrowed. Keyes, who had the keenest eyes, noticed that there was an old bruise on his neck that was almost invisible, and the wound on his lip did not seem to have dried up naturally. He should have been involved in a battle a few days ago. Chapter 1090. The law narrator suddenly drew his staff and dagger from his waist. His movements were so fast that Haramond could not see them clearly. The man wielded the weapons with both hands and twirled them skillfully. The young master of the Grimm family felt his blood boil as he tried to suppress the urge to draw his sword. The man continued to stare into his eyes, as if deep in thought, as if he was scheming something. After a while, the man grunted in satisfaction and put the 2 weapons back on his belt. He took a step back and raised his hands, the hostility on his face lessening. Catelyn's lookout post reported that 4 strangely dressed men had arrived near the town. Only then did the legal narrator rush over with his men. However, he could not bring many people with him, only 3. Most of the men were sent to help the villagers. They had already evacuated from the town's tunnels to the nearby birch forest. Before coming here, the law narrator had already mentally prepared himself. He was worried that these men were Prefect Top's warriors. After all, even though Haramond and his men were dressed strangely, the aura they exuded was undeniable. "You better hurry up." His words were interrupted by the sound of 2 long horns and 1 short horn. The sound came from the birch forest where the villagers were hiding. The law narrator's expression changed when he heard it. With the same speed as before, he drew his weapon again. Without any superfluous words, the man swung his club towards Halamond, who was the closest to him. However, this was only a feint. If the opponent raised a shield to block or dodged, then the dagger in his other hand would be like a sinister viper, seizing the opportunity to bite the opponent's throat. Apart from that, the other three men surrounding Harriman and his men reacted. One of them immediately raised his bow and shot at the musket-wielding man. The other two took down their shields and pulled out their steel axes from their waists. While chanting unknown slogans, they pounced on the dwarf who had just jumped down from the back of Keys's bicycle. After killing the long-range gunner, two of them went for Grindel, who was obviously a heavy-armored warrior. These men's decisions were very organized, and it was obvious that they had received corresponding training. That was why they gave up on attacking the old wiser who was riding on the back of a humpback horse. The latter was only dressed in linen clothes and did not carry any weapons or equipment. Instead, he carried a few bags on his back. He looked like an old servant who followed his master out and took care of his master's daily needs. Good timing. Grinder pulled out his battle axe from his back and swung it at one of the shields. At the same time, the dwarf tried to use his spiked helmet to break the other shield. If nothing unexpected happened, the two shields and the arms of the two people would be torn apart by the dwarf's battle axe and spiked helmet in the next second. However, Keys acted in time. The young gunslinger named Hugh Hood jumped up from his bicycle and somersaulted forward. Not only did he dodge the arrow that was shot at him, he also leaped over the heads of the two shield-wielding warriors that Grindel was facing. His two legs shot out at the same time and kicked the shoulders of the two men, sending them flying. At most, there would be a lump on their shoulders, but it was better than losing an arm each. Moreover, when he somersaulted, Keys took the opportunity to pull out his spear from his back. After landing, he rushed to the front of the archer and used the spear to break the bow's arm. The muzzle of the spear was directly aimed at the head of the burly man. "Stop!" Keys used an unquestionable tone to order the legal narrator. The man was distracted and his hand movements slowed by half a beat. His battle club smashed into Harriman's hurriedly raised shield, but the dagger in his other hand did not reach the enemy's throat. Seeing that the legal narrator was hesitant to attack, Harriman threw the shield to the ground to show that he had no intention of killing them. He then said, "We have nothing to do with the people in the birch tree forest." After saying that, he stepped on the edge of the shield on the ground with the sole of his shoe and caught the shield that bounced up. He then turned his head and walked towards his warhorse, Carrot. With a forceful push on the saddle, he rode on the back of the horse. Without saying anything else, Harriman pulled on the reins and steered the warhorse towards the birch tree forest. What is that human trying to do? The dwarf Grinder stuck his fingers into his helmet and scratched his head as he asked Keys in confusion. "Join in the fun, gain experience, good intentions," Keys said nonchalantly as he put the musket back on his shoulder. "But I reckon there will be a battle to fight. Moreover, it will definitely be more dignified than fighting with a few veterans here." Whether it was Weather, who was chasing after Harriman on the back of the warhorse, or the security officers of Catchelin Town who had just recovered from their days, none of them understood what he said. This was because Keys and Grinder were speaking in the Dwarven language. When Grinder heard about fighting a dignified battle, he immediately forgot about the unpleasantness of being killed by Keys. "Then what are we waiting for?" Grinder blinked his widened eyes and said. He then turned around and chased after Harriman and Weather. Because of his eagerness, the dwarf had even forgotten to ask Quith to ride on the wide-tire bicycle for a ride. Keys shook his head helplessly and walked to the side of the bicycle. He took out a metal chain from his satchel and chained the bicycle to the big tree beside the town. Then, he also carried his gun and ran towards the birch tree forest at a seemingly slow pace, but in reality, he was not slower than his companions. The security officers, who were prepared for the worst, looked at each other. In the end, they all looked at the legal narrator. "Sir, more than a dozen of our brothers and more than 200 villagers from the town are all hiding in that birch forest," the guard with the longbow said worriedly to the legal narrator. He was originally a hunter in town. His two younger brothers and his entire family were currently hiding in the forest. "Then what are we waiting for? Let's save as many people as we can from those wolf cubs. Let's go too." Hearing his words, the law narrator waved his hand and said bluntly, "But remember, we are outnumbered, so we must not fight them head-on." Chapter 1091. From the birch forest came a cavalry unit. Everyone was wearing armor, holding shields and weapons. Their armor was extremely light, and they did not wear the common iron breastplates and wide-brimmed helmets. Instead, they only wore mail armor and leather hats lined with iron plates. These people urged their war horses to trample the bushes in the forest. From time to time, they would use their long and narrow sabers to slash at the bushes. The Catalan villagers who had been hiding in the birch forest were pulled out one by the horsemen. Those who were unlucky or did not manage to dodge in time were injured. Some people wanted to resist the horsemen's violence, but in return, they were slashed at by the sabers. Their coarse clothes could not protect them. However, among the few who resisted, there were a few who were armed and caused trouble for the horsemen. They were not only constables of Catalan, but also brothers of the speaker of the law. They were also butchers or blacksmiths, occupations that only men of great strength can occupy. Unfortunately, their weapons were not handy. Their short sabers and axes could not cause too much damage to the horsemen who wore mail armor and held shields. On the other hand, the horsemen's long and narrow sabers were quite deadly. Every time a rebel fell to the ground, the horsemen would shout, "Shalamash." This word meant victory in the Tapt language. Not only did they want to boost their own morale, but they also wanted to intimidate the villagers. When Harriman rode into the birch forest, the first thing he heard was this word. The young master of the Green family pulled out his steel sword with a swish. I have to remind you that what you're facing now is neither the tundra trolls nor the modified humans that Mayor Grisus mentioned. They're just a group of mercenaries under the command of certain county governor in Topt. Before Harriman was about to ride his horse, Old Weather, who had been keeping a distance from him, suddenly said this. Harriman pondered for a few seconds. "You're right." Halliman nodded and sheathed his sword back into the sheath at his waist. The reason why he brought them to Catchland Town was that he did not want to wander blindly in the woods looking for the cyborgs. Instead of looking for a needle in a haystack, it was better to let the cyborgs find them. Although he still did not know which county head that group of cavalrymen belonged to, their ability to spread news was definitely much better than the honest villagers who dealt with the land. Thus, under Old Weasel's astonished gaze, Harriman took out a revolver from the satchel on the horse's back. Since this was the work of Harriman's metalworking internship when he was still in school, it wasn't a weapon provided by the Green family. That was why Harriman brought it to Tapt Island for self-defense. Of course, during the coming-of-age trial, he could not use this weapon. Since the revolver was made by himself, Harriman was very familiar with it. He took the pepper shaker, filled it with gunpowder, filled it with airtight flakes and bullets, and used the folding lever on the barrel to compress it. The entire process was done very quickly. In less than 10 seconds, he had finished reloading the 8-shot revolver. After gently turning in his hand to make sure the bullets were tightly pressed, Harriman pulled the hammer on the revolver. With a slight squeeze of his 2 legs, the war horse, Carrot, received the command and galloped into the birch woods like a gust of wind. With such a large target, it was impossible for the cavalrymen who were chasing the villagers in the woods to miss it. Thus, 3 of the cavalrymen immediately turned their horses around to meet this uninvited guest in a triangular formation. They saw Harriman holding a shield in his hand, but he did not draw his sword from his waist. At first, they did not think that he was here to teach them a lesson, but just a passing traveler. "Halt, intruder!" The cavalryman at the front of the formation pulled on the reins. The warhorse raised its front hooves slightly and stomped on the soft ground, neighing loudly. The cavalryman pointed his saber at Harriman and said, "The running wolves are fighting here. Those who have nothing to do with this, leave immediately, or we will take care of you as well." As he spoke, he even slashed twice in the air, the blade making a rustling sound as it cut through the air. In the intelligence scroll that Grisus gave him, Harriman had seen the introduction of the running wolves. It was the name of a mercenary under the command of Magistrate Messius. Messius was the king of the southern part of Tapt Island, a vassal of King Vixith. However, Messius wasn't a staunch supporter of the latter, and he didn't seem to care much about King Vixios's call for all the taps to work together against the Yamshan army. They probably didn't know that the Soft Maple had also launched an expedition. Those people are just villagers. You don't have to use your weapons against them. Harriman stated the truth. He had learned the tap language on the way to Tapt, but he was not fluent in it, and his accent was not perfect either. Thus, the cavalryman who had just shouted at him immediately realized that the two travelers in the forest were most likely not Tapteens. Attack! The cavalryman made a prompt decision and whispered to his companion. These two are foreigners. Be careful. As soon as he finished speaking, he urged his horse to charge forward. The other two riders also flanked the outsider from both sides. From the looks of it, they had made up their minds to defeat Halamond in a single exchange. Harriman could not help but frown. No matter how fast a horse was, could it be faster than a bullet? He raised a revolver in his hand and pulled the trigger 3 times in a row. Bang! 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 After the 3 gunshots, the smoke from the gunpowder enveloped Harriman's figure. Radish was startled by the gunshots, and the smell of the gunpowder made the warhorse sneeze a few times. Fortunately, it was a warhorse and was naturally more courageous. Furthermore, it had become familiar with Harriman over the past few days. After leaping out of the gunpowder smoke, Harriman calmed it down a little, and the warhorse calmed down once more. As for the 3 cavalrymen, they were in a worse state. They were too close to each other, and even though Harriman did not have much shooting practice, there was no chance of him missing. The 3 cavalrymen were shot in the chest and abdomen, and their chainmail was unable to protect them from the bullets. They were even pushed off their horses by the repulsive effect of the bullets. One of them was even trampled by a frightened warhorse. Clearly, he was not going to survive. The commotion here had obviously alerted the other running wolves. When the cavalrymen saw their comrade shot off their horses with a strange weapon, and it was unknown whether he was dead or alive, they all turned their horses around. They did not care about the country bumpkins who were being chased to the ends of the earth and sky, and all of them charged toward Harriman. They first urged their horses to trot, and then jogged with large strides. They did not move at all, and their pace was shockingly consistent. Without a doubt, these cavalrymen had undergone strict training, or else they would not be able to control their horses to perform such a standard charging action in the forest. Harriman lowered his body and pulled the reins, while he made Radish circle around to avoid being surrounded by the running wolf cavalrymen. At the same time, he turned his head and shouted to Old Weather, "You be careful." He urged his warhorse to charge toward the right flank where the cavalrymen were the least. He then emptied the remaining 5 bullets in his revolver. 4 horsemen fell to the ground. One of the horsemen who was shot rolled to the side in time before his horse fell to the ground, avoiding the misfortune of being crushed under his horse. This cavalryman's ferocious nature was stimulated. After he fell from his horse, he immediately transformed into a foot soldier and raised a shield in front of his chest as he charged toward Harriman. He was a muscular, dark-skinned man with a neatly trimmed beard under the chin guard of his leather helmet. He ran to Harriman's side where he was not holding a shield. At this moment, Harriman had just emptied his magazine and did not have the time to reload. He could only throw his weapon to the ground, and hurriedly pulled out his steel sword from his waist to deflect the saber that was slashing toward his calf. Following that, he used the momentum to cut off a few of the cavalryman's fingers that were holding the saber. The clever Radish also helped its master. It raised its hoof and kicked the cavalryman's shield, sending him and his shield flying a few steps away. The cavalryman fell to the ground and spat out blood. It was unknown whether he was dead or alive. Even though he had solved the problem in front of him, the ensuing enemies were even more troublesome. Harriman was only one person, while there were more than 30 running wolf cavalrymen in this birch forest. During the battle, he received a stab to his arm. The wound was not deep, and he still had a miraculous solution in his satchel, the same one he used in the basement of the hunting lodge, that could quickly heal the wound. However, he was in the midst of a fierce battle and could not be distracted to apply the solution on himself. Just as the situation became precarious, a turning point suddenly appeared. A dwarf wearing thick plate armor finally appeared in the forest. Finally, I made it, Grinder excitedly shouted in the dwarven language. Then, this dwarf, who looked like a tin can, charged toward Harriman, who was surrounded by the running wolf cavalrymen. He held his hatchet with both hands and hacked left and right, splitting the cavalrymen and their horses into two. Some of the cavalrymen's sabers struck the dwarf, but the moment their weapons came into contact with Grinder's plate armor, it was as if they had hit hard granite. They could not even leave a scratch on the armor. The dwarf was engaged in a fierce battle. From time to time, he would lower his body and duck under the belly of the enemy's horse. Every time he did so, a warhorse would fall to the ground with a wail. This was because the belly of the poor beast had been sliced open by the spikes on the dwarf's helmet. Blood and intestines would flow out of the horse's stomach at the same time. Chapter 1092. With the addition of a heavily armed dwarf warrior, Harriman had a moment of respite. He broke free from the encirclement and temporarily stopped. While recovering his strength, he assessed the overall situation of the battle. To his surprise, Old Weather, who was riding beside him, pulled out a dagger from his boot and stabbed a tapped wolf rider who was about to attack him. However, he saw that more people had joined the battlefield. They were riders wearing blue velvet robes over their armor. He looked at the wolf riders who were fighting with Grindel and found that the formation behind them had stabilized. While they were losing men, their line was gradually straightening out. It seemed that these people were already familiar with fighting in the woods. Suddenly, Old Weather shouted, drawing Harriman's attention back to the battlefield beside him. A tapped man, armed with a saber, was charging forward on his horse. Suddenly, his body tilted and hung on his saddle. It was the Catchland Town archer who had run into the birch woods and shot an arrow through his chest. However, the man's horse was still moving forward, its eyes wide with fear as it charged toward Radish's flank. The collision caused both sides to fall to the ground. Radish quickly stood up, snorting angrily, and kicked and bit the horse that had knocked it down. The frightened horse turned and ran, but Radish immediately chased after it. A wolf rider on a gray stallion once again lunged forward with his sword. He was as fast as lightning, and Harriman barely dodged the attack. He could only parry without being able to retaliate, until Old Weathers rushed over and stabbed the fellow to death. "Wait, young master!" The battlefield was noisy, and he could only shout. At the same time, he pulled on the reins and prepared to dismount. "Ride on my horse! Don't you dare dismount!" Harriman shouted. Following the Catchland archer into the birch woods were 3 other warriors, including the lawn narrator. Although they were not specially trained in archery like the Catchland archer, each of them had a crossbow. Even if they did not shoot fast enough, a crossbow was easier to aim. Even a child could use in battle. In addition to shooting at the wolf riders to slow them down, they were also calling out to the Catchland villagers who had just recovered from their shock to run away from the fighting in the woods. Escape was their only way out. Harriman had not seen Hugh Hood and did not know where the young rifleman had gone. However, he did not believe that the dwarf would run away in fear. After all, he was Grinder's friend, and a brave dwarf would never treat a coward with sincerity. In fact, this was indeed the case. At this moment, Big Head had found the most dangerous place in the birch forest. However, to him, the entire Ramsey Plain was not dangerous at all. 8 people against more than 100 people. In addition to the 30 or so wolf riders that had already appeared, there were still 20 or so other riders. All of them were wearing blue velvet robes, and 50 or so infantrymen waiting outside the birch tree forest, ready to join the battle. It was indeed somewhat beyond their power. However, if one could find the right blood vessels, even a viper could kill a bull. At this moment, Keyes was like a viper, hiding in the bushes. The soldiers, who had assembled and were preparing to march into the birch grove, were about 20 yards from him. Suddenly, there was a commotion in their ranks. The riders turned their horses around, and a rider rushed out with a hammer in his hand, shouting orders. He was riding on a mighty white warhorse. This rider was wearing a breastplate plated with white pearls and enamel. On the breastplate, there was a circular pattern outlined with golden thread, exactly the same as the wolf emblem erected in the middle of the formation. He did not wear a helmet, had a beard, and his bronze face was full of anger. Strangely, the riders around him wanted to stop him, and some even reached out to pull his reins. However, when they heard the white-armored man's stern reprimand, they obediently withdrew their hands. He urged his horse to trot, then stopped and pointed at the birch grove with his hammer. He then shook his reins and led his horse into the forest, using cavalry to charge at the enemy in the woods, even with infantrymen as cover. I don't know if he's too arrogant or just really stupid. Keyes gave a negative review of the man's actions. Moreover, the armor on his body was too eye-catching. A commander like this would be a live target on the battlefield. There was nothing to say. Keyes locked onto the white-armored man with the crosshairs and pulled the trigger. Although it looked like a common flintlock gun, the gun Keyes was holding was actually an electromagnetic nail rifle. Therefore, other than the sound of the steel nails piercing through the air, there was no gunpowder explosion when it was fired, nor was there any smoke. The man's white pearls and enamel breastplate could not provide effective protection at all. The steel nails drilled 2 holes in the breastplate. Blood gushed out from the wounds. The man covered the hole in his stomach in confusion, but ignored the other wound on his back. He was at a loss. He did not know where the thing that hurt him came from, and the riders beside him were the same. However, they all urged their horses forward to protect the man in white armor, which should be red armor now, using their shields and their own bodies to provide protection. The infantrymen lost their command and became a little scattered. After a dozen breaths, a few riders used their whips to teach them to maintain order. They had no other choice but to retreat. The bugle horn sounded again, but this time it was only a long and drawn-out cry, indicating that the troops were retreating. The wolf riders that were besieging Halamund and the others were puzzled. However, they still obeyed the order, pulling their reins and quickly retreating from the battlefield. More than 30 riders. Half of them were killed by the berserk dwarves and Halamund. They were about to explode from anger. However, after understanding what happened in the rear, these prideful wolf riders did not say much. Only 2 or 3 riders were left to supervise the retreat of the infantrymen, while the others were protecting the injured man. They quickly rushed to the nearest administrative area, where they could obtain the help of a doctor. A horseman had already unfastened the enamel plate of the Monsignor and fastened the puncture wound with a first-aid linen. To prevent the jolting of the horse from aggravating his injury, some of the riders in blue velvet robes took off their robes and tied them together to form a net to carry the wounded man. 2 of the riders fastened the net to the saddle and carried the great personage. The rest of the riders were scattered around, opening a path for them while also taking up the role of guard. They retreated in an orderly manner. Grinder cut open a piece of birch bark and drank some of its juice to quench his thirst and rinse his mouth. During the fierce battle, he was drenched in both horse and human blood. After a while, when the situation calmed down, he would have to take off the dwarven plate armor, wash it clean with water and a brush, and do some other treatment. Otherwise, the armor would probably start to rust. Keyes chewed on a piece of licorice and walked to the side of Halamund and the others. He patted the spear on his shoulder and said, "I injured an important person." He was not flaunting his achievements, but clearly described the appearance and attire of the white-armored man. Halamund, who had just found Carrot and calmed down his warhorse, immediately guessed the identity of the man. Mercius, nicknamed the White Knight, has an exquisitely crafted breastplate made of pearl white enamel, which he always wears. Halamund took a sip of the drink he took from his saddle and continued, "If you also see him holding a 6-page Morningstar hammer, then that man is undoubtedly Mercius, because that weapon is a token bestowed by King Tapt Vix to his important vassals. In his kingdom, only 6 people have the authority to pick up that kind of standard weapon. It is a symbol of status." The young soldier who disguised himself as Hugh Hood shrugged his shoulders. "It seems that I really injured an important person, but he did not die immediately. If he survives, he will most likely take more revenge." As he spoke, he looked at the Catchland villagers who were busy helping the injured and collecting the corpses. Needless to say, the The first thing that man will take revenge on is these bean farmers. Harriman furrowed his brows and fell into deep thought. He was troubled by some moral issues. From a perspective of the interests of the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army, it would definitely be beneficial to gain the support of the locals in a place dozens of miles away from the landing camp. But if they did that, it would be equivalent to tying the Catchalan farmers to another war chariot, and, at the same time, building hatred among the Taptoviks. And if the situation was allowed to develop on its own, the Catchalan farmers might not only have to face the revenge of Sheriff Mercius, but they might also end up like the Soft Maple Expeditionary Army when they arrived. Keyes seemed to have seen through Halamund's dilemma, so he simply reminded him, maybe you want to make a decision for those people, but their fates don't seem to be in your hands. Then, he pointed to the Catchalan legal officer who was cutting firewood and preparing to dispose of the corpses. Although he was also injured, it was not serious and would not affect his work. Everyone's fate belongs to themselves. Sometimes, there'll be a spokesperson. Halamund sized up his adventurous companion, whom he had known for a few weeks. This was the first time he found Big Head's words to be so thoughtful outside of banter. His words were like bullets fired from the muzzle of a gun. They never missed and went straight to everyone's heart. You're right. I have to talk to the person who is really responsible for this. Chapter 1093. When Harriman and the law narrator sat down to chat, a large pile of firewood had been piled up in an empty field outside the town of Catchalan. Whether it was the dead villagers, the security officers, or the wolf riders who had caused the deaths of the former, they were to be burned to ashes to prevent the plague from spreading. Amidst the crackling of the firewood and the weeping of the bereaved, Harriman learned the man's name for the first time. His name was Toulouse. This was both his surname and his given name. In other words, this law narrator was a descendant of a noble, but he had no one to whom he was loyal to. Before they started chatting, Toulouse was using a stone-pounding stone to grind down the chrysanthemum, yellow, and white flowers, as well as some other herbs. Then, he used a small bottle of distilled liquor to clean the wound, before wrapping the herbal paste around the wound with a clean linen cloth. He gave a demonstration to the others who were going to take care of the injured. After those people left, Toulouse began a formal conversation with Harriman. Toulouse went straight to the point. You're foreigners? That's right. We're from the Ramsey continent. You don't look like merchants, but more like elite mercenaries. But you're a little too few, not even a small mercenary team. Toulouse was puzzled as he spoke. He really could not guess the background of Harriman's group. Harriman pondered for a moment, deliberating over his words, and then said, We're adventurers. It's just that I'm now working for someone else to pay off the debt I incurred when crossing the sea by ship. Of course, my fellow adventurers don't need to be burdened by it, because I'm the one who brought us to Tapped Island. It has nothing to do with them. Toulouse immediately grasped the main point in Harriman's words. You're working for someone else? From the way you talk, you should be a noble from the Ramsey continent. Someone who can make you work for them must be a great noble. At this moment, Toulouse paused and looked at Harriman again with a hint of worry in his eyes. So many nobles from the Ramsey continent are gathered here. This is definitely not a good thing for Tapped. They have an expeditionary force, more numerous than you can imagine. Harriman looked Toulouse in the eye. At the same time, he also confirmed the other party's suspicions with his words, but he did not reveal the identity of the Soft Maple people. Furthermore, they have already formed an alliance with the Jomi's allied army that has occupied half of Tapped in the north. In less than a month, the two armies will meet near the capital of Wessex. Why are you telling me this? Toulouse didn't have a good impression of the Yamshans who had wreaked havoc in the northern lands of Tapped. In fact, most of the Tapps were like this. Only the blacksmiths who were requisitioned and a small number of merchants who were allowed to do business with the army were exceptions. However, he soon understood the deeper meaning of Harriman's words. Is the large expeditionary force you mentioned nearby and can take down Catchalan at any time? Harriman nodded. However, he did not reveal that the Soft Maple army was only a few dozen kilometers away from Catchalan. If they were to march at full speed, It would take at most a day and a half for the infantry to reach the town. Although he could reveal the soft maple strategic plans, they were all here to obtain wealth and occupy land. Anyone who could think on Tapped Island would be able to easily deduce this. He did not mention a single word about their tactical deployment. Messias was escorted to a town called Lashford by the Wolf Riders. The Wolf Riders stirred up a huge commotion in the town before they finally found the chief physician appointed by the prefectural administration. However, the man did not have a good way to treat Magistrate Matius's injuries. He could only use a soldering iron to heal the flesh, apply some anti-inflammatory ointment, and then force the magistrate to drink some strong liquor mixed with skuma to relieve the pain. After that, the Wolf Riders did not care about their exhaustion. They forcibly commandeered some good horses from the stables in Lashford and took Messias on their journey once more. They did not care about the strength of their legs at all. Each Wolf Rider took turns to ride. Finally, they arrived at the prefectural capital, Valensburg, in the evening of the second day. At this time, Messias was delirious from his fever and had only drunk a small amount of water for the entire day. Fortunately, the prefectural capital was a prefectural capital. Not only did Valensburg have more physicians, alchemists, and apothecaries than all the other towns in the territory combined, there were also a few magi hired by the prefectural governor. The physicians first consulted Messias before performing an emergency operation to treat the blood clots and inflamed and suppurated wounds in his body. During the operation, the alchemists used the precious universal blood tonic to prolong Messias's life. Next, the sorcerers took turns to cast minor healing, and the flesh and blood that had been cleaned up from the inside out grew back. At noon on the second day, after Messias lay on his large bed, this great lord of the southern part of Nantapped Island, a great noble, an important vassal of King Vixith, and one of the 6 important prefectural governors of Nantapped Island finally opened his eyes. According to the physician's instructions, he could not drink alcohol for a period of time, so he only dipped his honey bread in wine. However, apart from this small flaw, the goat cheese, cream of mushroom soup, and oatmeal pudding provided by the kitchen were to his liking. After resting for 2 days, green cheese, capers, honey-roasted wild boar meat, black pudding, pickled herring, and other heavier foods appeared on his dining table. This meant that Messias's health had recovered to its previous state. Miraculous magic, superb medical skills. Messias could not help but sigh inwardly. Of course, as a qualified ruler, he would not forget some other people, and loyal warriors. Only the combination of these 3 can ensure the safety of King. He called for his clerk on the day he recovered. Messias needed to write 2 letters. One was to be sent to King Vixith, informing him of the injustice his loyal vassal had suffered. The other letter was to be sent to the Northumbrian sheriff, Ellerwin, who had a territorial dispute with him. He wanted an explanation as to why he had been attacked by people using unknown weapons while hunting in the disputed land. Chapter 1094. Your Majesty the Wise and Revered King Vixias, Lord of the 6 fiefs of Nantapped, the actual owner of Tinsburg and Wickford and the Twin Cities, may you have a long reign and be in good health. Your loyal vassal and servant, Messias, sends you my sincere blessings from your bed in Wallingsburg. Hunting in the birch forest near the town of Catchlin has seriously damaged my health and my honor. Myself and my family members wish to obtain a fair and just judge. I hope you can authorize me to temporarily take over the legal judgment and arrest of bandits in the town of Catchlin, so that peace can be restored here. The clerk used the official language of the Nanaput region to recite Zhang Yu's copy of the letter fluently, but the man sitting behind the desk did not look up. The man was bent over a scroll of parchment, his quill flying across the paper, leaving behind long, thin handwriting. The man was old, in his 60s, but his shoulders were still broad and his body strong. His long hair was no longer as red as it used to be. It was now gray, but there were still traces of copper in it. He was wearing a plain, white linen jacket with ink stains on the cuffs. He only had one accessory on him, which was a golden stamp ring on the ring finger of his right hand. The pattern on the ring was a sturdy horse standing upright. After reading the letter, the clerk bowed and put the copied letter on the desk of the old man in front of him. Then he left the small study. When he left, he did not forget to turn the lock so that the door would lock from the inside when it hit the door frame. The old man who was working at his desk did not raise his head. The quill in his hand kept jumping on the parchments, but from time to time, he would pick up some fine white sand from the sand jar to absorb the ink. The only sound in the room was the rustling of his writing. Books were piled up against the wall, almost reaching the ceiling. There were also scroll boxes between the piles, some of them old and worn. The only decoration was a large map of the southern kingdom of Nantaput that hung over the fireplace. There were some brief annotations, the handwriting still thin and long. Strangely, some of the annotations were written in red ink, while others were written in black. There was a list of names at the bottom edge of the map, all written in black ink but crossed out in red ink. It was a long list. The name Messias was there, but it had not been completely written, nor had it been crossed out with a pen dipped in red ink. Phew! After finishing the last letter that had to be sent out today, the old man finally stood up. He exhaled a mouthful of turbid air, twisted his stiff neck, and stretched himself. He drank a glass of milk on the table and ate a few biscuits with bits of pickled fruit and nuts. That was the end of his dinner. Although only the rich would be able to afford those refined biscuits if they were sold in a pastry shop, as a king, Vixith's dinner was so simple that it made one's heart ache. However, he didn't care. Wasting is not only a shameful act, but also an unforgivable crime. Especially in a place like Tapt, where resources are limited, King Vexith told himself inwardly, something his father had taught him since he was a child. He crossed his fingers, leaned his elbows on the table, and stared at the copied letter from Messias, who had several major vassals under his command. He fell into deep thought and calculation. He was weighing the gains and losses. Should I get the modified human to change direction and take care of this official's health? The Northumbrian soldiers had been on the road for 10 days. The orange and lemon trees were getting thinner and thinner, replaced by a dense forest. The trees were nameless, and the further north they went, the taller they became. The temperature was also rising, and the journey was scorching. It was really torturous to be drenched in sweat every day. They didn't like the forest. It was full of a rotten smell, and countless annoying insects buzzed noisily. It was like a madhouse at night. The only light came from the half-moon above the canopy, painting everything in the forest with a layer of light blue. Leading them was Sheriff Ellerwin, who rode a trained pony at the front of the group. Each group of soldiers was given a small bottle of anti-mosquito ointment, which was kept and distributed by the captain. They couldn't light fires and smoke away mosquitoes when they were resting in camp, so they could only use the ointment bought from the alchemist to fight off the insects. Other than mosquitoes, there were other dangerous creatures hidden in the forest. For example, tigers, poisonous snakes, and wild boars that rummaged around for food. Fortunately, there were more than 200 people in the Northumbrian army, and those animals generally wouldn't provoke so many scary upright apes gathered together. Once, the army encountered a jungle sloth that was foraging for food. The beast was at least 15 or 16 feet tall when it stood up straight, and its body was covered in long, fluffy hair. It crawled around on 4 thick but long legs, and its claws were frighteningly sharp. Its head was like a long pipe, and its mouth was only a slit. It let out an unclear howl when it tore off saplings, and the crackling sound of branches breaking echoed in the forest. Fortunately, the army scouts discovered it in time. The soldiers all held their breaths for a while, and the jungle sloth disappeared. After trekking for a while, they finally saw a large river that bordered the forest, and there was a small town formed by stilted buildings on the shore. The river was nearly a mile wide, but unlike the usual riverside towns, there was no ferry in sight. The town simply spanned across the river, and the foundations of the town's buildings were some stilted platforms made of wood and bricks. There were many houses on top of the platforms, and the building style was the same as the crumbling buildings. Each platform was connected by a rope bridge, and there were some small boats that were constantly traversing the river. There were two canals built next to the river in the town, which could be regarded as a moat and could also be used as a flood channel during the rainy season. When the original builders designed the town, they must have put in a lot of effort, and the whole town was built to be easy to defend and difficult to attack. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been used as an important frontier of the country and used to connect the various trading towns in the area where the river flowed. Elwine of Northumbria had come to the town under the orders of King Vixias to take over its jurisdiction. According to the information from the coastal areas in the north and east, the Yomians who came to attack Tapt Island had found another powerful ally. One of them was going to come down from the north, while the other was going to come down from the east. The two armies would soon form an alliance near this place. If the alliance was successful, the scattered trading towns would become supply points for the enemy army. The grain, steel, coal, leather, and cloth that were supposed to be transported between the north and south of Tapt Island, but were temporarily piled up in the warehouses because of the war, would become an aid for the enemy when they went down south to plunder the country. The mayor of this river-crossing town was a merchant nobleman, so he was used to judging the situation. King Vixias didn't trust the man's integrity and courage, so he ordered Elwine of Northumbria to personally take over this important river pass. He brought 300 of his personal guards into the town and immediately announced the king's order to the public. He then removed the mayor's authority to mobilize the army and let him return to his home to write a report. Apart from the platform where his family was located, the mayor and his relatives were not allowed to set foot on any other platforms. Otherwise, they would be arrested and tried. In less than half a day, more than a dozen small towns along the river had also submitted their orders of obedience to Elwine. The mayors of each town sent their guards to the Northumbrian commandery's army for deployment and combat training. There weren't too many of these soldiers, at least compared to the tens of thousands of Yomians and soft maple soldiers mentioned in the information sent by King Vixias. 3,000 was not a deterrent number. Elwine of Northumbria couldn't mobilize more men from his fief and his soldiers at cities, towns, and villages that needed to be protected. But fortunately, compared to the soldiers who forcefully pulled people from the peasants and stuffed them with sticks or spears to make up the numbers, the guards of the trading towns were semi-professional soldiers. Although they hadn't fought a real battle, they had all received a certain degree of military training and captured vicious bandits. They had also seen blood in order to maintain order in their respective towns. Elwine broke up the original organization and reorganized them according to different standards. He let his personal guards lead and train them, hoping to create a river patrol army before the war. In addition to training the soldiers, Elwine also took on the task of litigating and explaining the law. He had to sort out the connections between the various trading towns along the river as much as possible. It was precisely because of this that the Northumbrian lords understood for the first time why King Vixias had left some undecided autonomous towns that weren't part of the 6 major fiefs. The relationships between them were too chaotic, and only time could dilute the barriers between them and make them easier to govern and manage. But due to the impending war, Elwine didn't have much time left. He could only sleep for 5 hourglasses a day at most, and the rest time was even less than when he led the army through the forest. Fortunately, the trading towns along the river didn't lack tea stocks, and Elwine had to rely on those precious herbal drinks to keep himself awake. So, when he received a letter written by his old rival Messias from his bed, since Messias couldn't read or write, the letter must have been written by his clerk, copied in Chinese, and sent to his desk. Elwine almost flipped the table in anger. That ignorant and incompetent old idiot is playing tricks again. Ignoring the fact that the other party was a noble like him, Elwine cursed in front of his subordinates. Chapter 1095. It was market day, and the guards at the city gate were too busy collecting fees from the peddlers to bother with them. Radish twitched its nostrils and even raised its front hooves because of the strong human odor. Harriman had to dismount to placate it. "You don't like it here, do you?" He fed Radish a carrot as he spoke. "That's all right. We won't be here for long, I promise you." They pushed and shoved their way through the crowd for an hour before they finally made their way out and plunged into the crisscrossing streets of the market. They wandered about aimlessly for a long time before they finally found an inn with a stable. The sign hanging at the door read "Coachman's Rest Stop." The inn was crowded with travelers and livestock traders, most of whom were empty-handed. Seeing Harriman carrying a weapon, they all avoided him. When a waiter came up to greet him, Harriman gave the half-grown lad a full 20 coppers, tapped her square currency, and told him to get some hard fodder for his turnip and Old Weasel's poor horse, and to get some food for their table as well. Soon, the boy brought them a large bowl of hot stew, 2 plates of baked pies, and a jug of ale. The stew and ale tasted the same everywhere, but the 2 plates of baked pies were quite substantial. They were worth the extra coppers Harriman had given them. The soft dough was stuffed with mutton steeped in wine and roasted mushrooms, giving it a unique flavor. "We won't stay in Wallingsburg for more than 2 days. We'll leave after we confirm the whereabouts of that magistrate Macius," Harriman whispered to Old Weasel as he ate his pie. His voice was as soft as a mosquito's, but the old servant miraculously heard every word he said. This ability made Harriman very curious. If young Master Harriman didn't care about the lives of those lowly commoners, we wouldn't even have to risk our lives here. After dinner, Harriman spent a few more copper coins in exchange for a room for the 2 of them to stay in temporarily. There was no bed in the room, only a thick layer of hay on the floor. Harriman could only hope that there weren't so many fleas in the room. Using the last bit of daylight, Old Weather used a charcoal pencil to write down today's diary in a book that he would bring back to Jadewood City. Unlike Harriman and Old Weather, Gollander and Hugh Hood were too eye-catching. The former was a dwarf wearing thick armor, while the latter was a musketeer. They would not give up their weapons just to enter the city to scout for information. Thus, they stayed outside Valensburg and did not follow Harriman into the city. They found a run-down ranger's hut. It was overgrown with weeds and on the verge of collapse, but it was still habitable and sheltered them from the night fire. The young soldier went out to look for food and brought back roots and mushrooms, as well as 2 trout that he had caught with his bare hands. The 2 fish were swimming in the nearby stream. Unfortunately, they were too close to the shore, so he scooped them up. He removed the innards of the fish, wrapped them in burdock leaves, and roasted them over the fire. Smelling the aroma of the fish, Grindel revealed a ferocious expression and wolfed down his portion. "Hunger is always the best seasoning," he commented after he finished eating. Keyes didn't care about the hidden meaning in the dwarf's words. Under the dwarf's surprised gaze, he magically took out a pile of cumin, chili powder, salt, basil, and rosemary leaves and sprinkled them on the fish. Finally, he took out a lemon and squeezed its juice evenly over the fish. "This is a snack," Keyes said matter-of-factly. With his size, even if all the fish in the river were added together, it wouldn't be enough for him to eat until he was full, let alone a single fish. "It's just a taste." The dwarf felt a deep sense of malice. He went out to find a big tree and punched and kicked it to digest his food before returning to sleep. The next morning, Keyes hunted a deer for breakfast. He only ate 1 leg, while Glindo stuffed the rest of the ribs and 3 legs into his stomach. "Eat breakfast like a king," the dwarf said to Keyes. Keyes agreed with his point of view, so he took out a bottle of milk wine and shared it with Glindo. "I'm going to take a look at Wallingsburg. I'm getting bored here, and I need to speed up this adventure." After breakfast, Keyes covered the campfire with moist soil, leaving only a few dry branches smoldering in the hole below. Some smoke and dust would be released into a nearby shrub through the flue pipe dug out yesterday, so it wouldn't attract attention. Every few hourglasses, he only needed to add a few sticks of wood from a hole the size of a finger to keep the fire burning, so he didn't have to reignite it the next time. As for what Keyes said, Glindo didn't want to think too much about it. After all, he returned to Ramsey this time to be a guide for his companion who had gone on an underground adventure in the Ash World. If it wasn't a mission that required him to go down into a mine, as an underground digger, he wouldn't usually make his own decisions. "Come back quickly. Also, leave some ale for me." He knew that Keyes had all kinds of drinks in his spatial equipment. "Don't drink too much. This is authentic Bergman dwarf beer. I saw Bergman brew it with my own eyes." It's much more precious than the imitation in the cellar of clan leader Grimm's hunting house. Keyes agreed to the dwarf's request, leaving behind a small barrel of precious high-quality ale and a sentence that made the dwarf a little confused. He then turned and walked towards Wallingsburg. No way, my tongue never lies to me. Keyes did not swagger in the city gate. He disguised the spear in his hand and stuffed it into an ox cart that was transporting fruits. After entering the city, he secretly pulled it out of the cart. After watching the ox cart rumble away, he looked up at the steeple in the distance and walked along the street to the central square of Wallingsburg. Other than King's Landing City, which had no relevant buildings when it was planned, it was easy to find the residence of the ruler of a city, whether it was on the Ramsey continent or Tapped Island. The ground of the square was paved with granite, and flocks of pigeons flew around, gathering and dispersing. The steeple was right behind the square, and next to it was a magnificent 3-story mansion with many windows. It was surrounded by a 10-foot-high stone wall with iron spikes on top. Guards patrolled along the wall in pairs from time to time, and there were 5 people guarding the gate. He counted at least 1 archer on the roof. It was obvious that Magistrate Mischius was very concerned about his own safety. Keyes walked around the manor a few times, trying to hide in the shadows and avoid being seen. He found 8 more archers on the roof at the back, and 4 guarding the back door. The wall was well maintained, and the nearest cover was more than 20 yards away. The guards were quite alert, changing shifts every 2 hours. There should be a canal underground that could be used to sneak into the manor, but he had reason to believe that the person in charge of Mischius's safety would definitely guard such a place to the death. Ordinary people would not be able to get in, Keyes finally concluded. He sat on a step next to the square and took an apple that he had just bought from a fruit vendor. "Are you here to petition?" the man asked as soon as he took a bite. "You don't look like a city dweller. Look around with your eyes wide open." Keyes knew what he meant. As the law speaker of Wallingsburg, Mischius followed the system passed down by his ancestors. On the first day of every month, the legal residents of his territory could come to Wallingsburg to petition. They would get wooden tokens with numbers from 1 to 200, or even more, depending on Mischius's mood that day, and line up in the square to wait for Mischius to hear their case and make a legally binding judgment. At noon, Mischius would also provide lunch for these petitioners. Although it was not a big meal, it was definitely not enough to starve them. "The nobleman from where I came from has a forest fenced off and doesn't allow us hunters to go in and hunt," he said while chewing an apple. "But even if we follow the rules, we still have to pay forest tax to the nobleman once a year." The vendor nodded. He felt that it was better not to get involved in the topic of nobles. Suddenly, his eyes glanced behind Keyes, and he immediately put away his chatty expression and knelt on one knee. Keyes turned around and saw a group of people entering the square from the north. Wherever they went, the people around them knelt down. Walking at the front was a young man in a long robe. He walked with steady steps and held up a banner with a green vine pattern. Behind him were 5 people walking side by side. They were all dressed in dark green, and each of them had a book in each hand. Walking at the back of the group was an old man in a plain white robe. He looked straight ahead, calm and composed, and had an extraordinary bearing. It was just that his bulging abdomen was a bit of an eyesore. "Kneel down, boy," the fruit vendor scolded softly. "Do you want to be whipped?" At the reminder of the fruit vendor, Keyes also knelt on one knee. Of course, this was only what the people around him saw. Just like when the fruit vendor talked to him, he only had eyes for a young man with a shoulder pole. But in fact, he just stood there and ate the apple clean. It was a chanter. Keyes thought for 2 seconds before he remembered where he had seen similar clothing and heraldry in a book. Those people belonged to a relatively small druid sect called city chanters. At this time, the group had already walked a few yards up the stairs. The old man in the white robe lifted the hem of his robe and walked up the stairs. His facial features were nothing special. Apart from his slightly hooked nose, his face was full of wrinkles, and his eyes were dull. It was hard to tell if he was good or evil. Chapter 1096. Messias tried on 4 coats in succession before he finally found a satisfactory dress for the petition day. a set of plain white silk clothes with a crimson tunic over the shoulders, a ruffled collar around his neck, and a gold breastplate inlaid with onyx and gemstones. On his feet, he wore a pair of dark brown calfskin boots made of the finest hickory wood, which produced a clattering sound similar to that of a horse's hooves when he stepped on the ground. Power comes with a price. Messias was well versed in this. When he was young, his father had personally held his hand and explained to him the principle: all power, the power to rule, the power to kill, the power to gather the will of the people, must be obtained with a price. Thus, even though he had just recovered from his injuries and was still feeling tired, he still had to appear in front of the petitioners in Valensburg today. He had the guards open the gates of the house, but only the audience hall outside the inner walls was opened. The inner chambers were the last bastions of the county magistrate, and outsiders were rarely allowed in. The inside of the examination hall was spectacular. The arches and windows were extremely tall, and the sunlight that shone through the stained glass was dyed in various colors. The air was filled with the rich smell of incense. After a long time, everyone was finally in place. The nobles and merchants in fine clothes were in the front row. The poor were in the back, and the poorest could only lean against the wall. A family guard walked along the line with an open gunny sack in his hand. As he walked past, the petitioners in the line reached into the sack and took out a wooden medallion. Before these people were led through the gate, they were all examined one by one, and it was only after they had ascertained that they were not armed that they were allowed to proceed. They passed through a field full of fruit trees and grotesquely trimmed shrubs, and finally entered the audience hall. Each of them received a number plate, in order of 1 to 100, and the rich had no priority. Later, when a number is called, you will step out of the line and follow us to petition. Remember, the number plates are not to be traded or changed. Do not whisper to each other, do not fight, and do not spit on the ground. Otherwise, you will be whipped and in serious cases cut. The family guard walked past the petitioners, making sure that his words were heard by all of them. He was followed by 3 soldiers with halberds, and there were even more soldiers hiding behind rows of pillars in the audience hall. Harriman lowered his head and looked at the number tag in his hand. Number 89 could be said to be very far back. Before entering Warlensburg, he had dyed his black hair a reddish-brown with a dye made from insects to hide his black hair, which was very eye-catching on Tapt Island. But the hastily made dye had faded a little last night, and today he must buy a woolen kerchief from the market and wrap his hair in it. The first petitioner was an old man. He had come on behalf of the villagers to complain about the recent increase in rent, blaming their landlord for spoiling his son too much. Buy him a horse every month, my lord. That won't do. Everyone is starving, but that 12-year-old young master insists on riding the newly bought stallion. The name of your landlord? Asked Messias. It is Lord Gavin, my lord. I remember that his eldest son went to a duchy in the north a few years ago to study as a squire for a night, and was killed in a battle with the pirates of Joms. Messias thought for a moment, recalling the name Gavin. The collar around his neck made it difficult for him to lower his head or turn his head. Yes, my lord. Since then, Lord Gavin has doted on his youngest son more and more, replied the old man. Your story has been recorded, said Messias to the old man. We will discuss the decision as soon as possible. And so, one by one, the petitioners told the same sad story. Unjust rent, arbitrary disinheritance, land grabs, and a young girl who asked for a sum of money to buy a wooden prosthetic leg for her grandfather, who had been crippled in the service of some ambitious ancestor of the feudal lord. I think the decision can be passed at once. Messias made a gesture, and a servant came forward and handed the girl a purse containing twice as much money as she had asked for. There was a commotion, and everyone was full of praise. He is not stupid. Harriman thought to himself. This magistrate, Messias, clearly knew how to prioritize when dealing with matters. However, such a person would also become very terrifying when they hated someone or something. At noon, the servants carried the table and benches into the hall, and the table was soon covered with bread, chicken, cheese, and steaming bowls of soup. The food was ordinary but rich. The petitioners sat down happily to eat, but the magistrate had already left the hall to dine alone. Harriman noticed that many of the petitioners remained, even though they had already petitioned. It was understandable that the poor would do so, but it was interesting that some of the rich would do so as well. The petitioning continued in the afternoon, and soon after it began, Harriman guessed why the rich had stayed. They wanted to see a spectacle, or rather, how their magistrate would deal with the storm. How Messias dealt with the matter would determine how the rich would treat a group of people who had been in contact with them. An old man in a plain white robe walked to the center of the audience hall and stood precisely on the relief of a fine horse on the floor. His voice was not loud, but everyone in the audience hall could hear him clearly. The position was well chosen, and Harriman saw the distance. As Herod, his knowledge often enabled him to draw parallels. Reverend Magistrate Messias, on behalf of the congregation, I would like to extend my greetings to you. Yesterday was the day of reconciliation, and the congregation took inventory of the past loans and unfinished construction projects. As he spoke, he extended his hand, and a congregation deacon in a dark green robe immediately ran over and placed a scroll in the elder's hand. The various landlords in the fief owe the congregation the following. Serene Ruger built a mill, but there are still 500 silver cubes of material loan outstanding, and interest will be added on the overdue portion. Baron Winkler built 2 mansions and hired 33 certified craftsmen from the congregation, but there is still a total of 1,627 silver cubes and 15 copper. Lord Gavin built a first-class stable, but there are still 53 silver cubes of material and labor fees owed to the congregation. Last year, Magistrate Messias of Valensburg, that is, you built a drainage canal, a warehouse in the commercial district, a racetrack and a mansion, and a series of important city defense facilities that should not be disclosed to the public, as well as the repairs and maintenance of the spire. Including the discount provided to you and the taxes that the congregation has to pay this year, you still have a total of 36,000 silver cubes of debt outstanding. Interesting, Harriman thought to himself. Someone actually dared to demand payment from Messias on the petition day. His ears perked up as he carefully listened to the whispers of the people around him. Soon, he had a general understanding of the so-called congregation. As it turned out, it was an organization of druids, and the druids in it were the more obscure branch of city druids. Because they were favored by King Vixith, the congregation had a lot of influence in the southern kingdoms. They relied on providing loans to the various feudal lords to build their territories, as well as contracting the construction projects of the various feudal lords to earn money to maintain the congregation's operations. There were also some merchants who had purchased the services of the congregation, but only a small group of the wealthiest merchants had the financial resources to do so. Some people guessed that the congregation was able to gain the support of King Vixith because they could build cities in the king's fief at a very reasonable price. The money used to support the construction of those cities was earned by the druids from the various feudal lords and wealthy merchants. However, there was no concrete evidence. Through listening to the news, coupled with the knowledge gained from his higher education in King's Landing, Harriman had a clearer view of the congregation's actions than anyone else present. Apart from the congregation's operation model, he also had a rough idea of the congregation's objectives. Even though they did not worship a specific god, but since these druids were of the city druids branch, they could only promote their teachings by constantly building and perfecting larger cities, allowing the druids within the congregation to grow stronger. Building a more complete large-scale city was undoubtedly in line with the intentions of King Vixith, who was known for his great talent and bold vision. That was why the congregation and the king came to an agreement. With the combination of the two, the congregation and the kingdom could both become more powerful. To be honest, this was very much in line with the concept of the scale of perpetual order in the Ramsey continent. In other words, King Vixith's choice to cooperate with the Druid conclave was actually the correct choice to lead the country to prosperity. However, Harriman vaguely felt that their model was different from that of the scale of perpetual order. The scales of eternity chamber of commerce guided the development of the various city-states in the Ramsey continent. Generally, they would start by investing in the construction of high-standard roads. Then, such roads would naturally attract more pedestrians to walk on them and use them to reach the various cities. First, there would be more traffic, then the cities would develop and expand on their own. On the other hand, the model of the Southern Kingdom, Tapped Island, was the exact opposite. The king relied on the congregation to build attractive cities, then relied on these cities to attract more people. Actually, it was still unknown which of the two models was better. Harriman did not want to admit his superiority, so he felt that the model of Tapped Island was likely to be problematic. However, another person who was also listening to the congregation's petition, Keyes, who was standing in the corner of the audience hall with his arms crossed, felt that this model had its merits. Chapter 1097. In order to ensure the normal operation of the congregation, as well as the smooth progress of the construction projects of the lords, landlords, and wealthy merchants, I believe that within 10 days after the petition day, the sound of gunfire interrupted the elder's words. The chest and back of his white robe were dyed red by the blood that gushed out from his wounds. A few deacons in dark green robes rushed forward. Some of them tried to press on the elder's wounds with their hands, but to no avail. Among the petitioners, a man in a dirty, patched shirt ran desperately toward the door. He held a short, thick, double-barreled musket in his hand. As he ran, he fired at the guards of the Messias family, who tried to pounce on him. "Catch him!" a deacon of the congregation yelled. He had just stood up beside the elder who had lost his life, and there was still a pool of blood on his hand. But as he clasped his hands together, a relief sculpture of a knight on the wall in front of the audience hall leaped out of the wall. The thin knight raised his spear and charged at the assassin. The man used the last shot in his double-barreled musket to disperse the knight in front of him. But as soon as he stepped out of the audience hall, a crossbow bolt pierced his throat. Messias stood up from his seat and tore off the stiff collar around his neck. In his other hand, he pulled out a crossbow from under his seat. Sheriff Messias led his men to the assassin's side. With the tip of his shoe, the man fell to the ground with his face facing the sky. "Tell me, who sent you?" Sheriff Messias stepped on the man's chest and roared at him with spittle flying out of his mouth. Unfortunately, the crossbow bolt had already torn the man's vocal cords, and he could only let out a meaningless whimper. His face was turning purple, and it was obvious that he was about to suffocate to death. Messias frowned, perhaps because his shoe had touched something. He bent down and took out a piece of parchment from the man's chest. Although he was illiterate, there were still people in the audience hall who could read. Messias handed the parchment to a deacon of the congregation who hurried over. "Read it to me," Messias said to the deacon. But the deacon stopped after a few sentences and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. "It's okay. There's nothing to hide from the petitioners." Messias waved his hand. "Read it out loud, and let everyone know who this man is." Well, the deacon had to obey. The current Joms ranger, Carl, is hired by all the villagers of Catchlin Bazaar to eradicate the greedy elder of the congregation. Due to the latter's advice to Magistrate Messias, the residents of Catchlin Town are unable to afford the corresponding taxes due to the construction of buildings everywhere in the fief. This agreement is made in duplicate. After the bounty is completed, Carl himself can take this agreement to Catchlin and ask for the balance of the bounty, which is a total of 100 silver coins. The deacon's words immediately sparked a heated discussion among the petitioners. Most of the petitioners of the Catchlin Bazaar of Catchlin Bazaar. People were constantly exchanging their opinions in low voices, and the entire audience hall was filled with buzzing sounds like bees flapping their wings. "Silence!" Messias roared. "Where's the clerk?" Before his voice trailed off, a man ran out from the back of the audience hall with a quill in his hand. He seemed to have forgotten to put it on the table in a hurry. "My lord," the man panted, "write me a long list of words." Messias spread his hands in front of him about a yard apart. "Tell my vassals, allies, and supporters who paid a despicable bounty colluded with the Joms bastards who invaded Tapt, and plotted the murder of the elder of the congregation in front of me on such a holy day. Every strand of Messias's beard seemed to stand up as he spoke, and he looked terrible when he was angry. In an instant, the entire audience hall fell silent. No one even dared to breathe loudly. The ruler of Valensburg scanned the crowd with his eyes, as if looking for dissidents. "I will punish the outlaws of Catalan Bazaar in the name of law and justice." He nodded with satisfaction. This was the right atmosphere. Messias reached out and pulled out the scepter tied to his belt. It was his 6-page hammer called the Morning Star. He gripped the handle of the scepter with his hand. "Of course," he said loudly, "I will also be merciful. Let's start with this poor fellow." He pointed the scepter at the assassin who had a crossbow bolt in his throat, then bent down and smashed the man's head with the hammer, ending the man's suffering. The day of petition ended abruptly. Because of his sudden assassination, many petitioners' demands were not resolved. One of them was the Druid Conclave, which had lost an elder. Harriman followed the crowd out of the audience hall and immediately returned to the inn to find old weather. He had already understood Messias's idea. It was time to go back to Catalan and recruit allies for the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force. Their lord was a very narrow-minded and insidious person. The townspeople had no other choice. Valensburg issued an order for the army to gather. The army could depart tomorrow and reach Catalan the day after tomorrow to exact their righteous revenge. In other words, Harriman could find the gunslingers and dwarves waiting outside the city within a day, then rush to the town at full speed. Then he could persuade the law clerk and the villagers under his rule with a few words, then use a communication scroll to contact Grisus and have him send people to Catalan to help with the defense of the town. If all went well, the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force would be able to exchange blows with the Lord and Sheriff of Catalan Bazaar in 2 days. At that time, with their advantage in numbers and weapons, Messias would not be able to escape as easily as he did in the Battle of Birch Forest. And if King Vixais lost such a high-ranking official, the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force would quickly conquer and occupy his territory. The only problem was that if they took over Messias's territory too easily, the Soft Maple Expeditionary Force would be able to reap the fruits of their victory. Several cities, including Valensburg, villages rich in agricultural products, and the wealth stored in the mansions of the nobles. But their desire to plunder when they first crossed the sea would not be able to be vented on the people of the territory. This was a very tricky problem for an army, especially one that played the role of an invader. It was related to the morale of the army. But that was a problem for the mayor and the Lord's Council to worry about. Harriman did not want to solve it for them. Chapter 1098. Oh, of course. Times have changed. Old Weasel thought for a moment and said, "Nowadays, apart from a small number of bandits who practice bows and crossbows, most of them use inferior firearms to make up for the numbers. They don't like to use weapons like swords anymore." Harriman nodded. That was indeed the case. However, bandits who preferred firearms over swords didn't live long in the Ramsey continent either. That was because the patrols in the various cities were also issued firearms of better quality and longer range. Those bandits either died in a purge or were killed by their own firearms. However, Harriman couldn't help but think of the Japanese bandit group that had recently appeared in the Green family's territory. He wondered how they had been purged. Did the lightning monk in that group cause any trouble? Next, the guard at the city gate continued to shout for the people in the queue to walk to the city gate. Regardless of whether one entered or exited the city, one had to pay a gate fee of 2 copper coins. However, because there was a curfew in Wallingsburg, compared to the cost of a night's stay in the city, it was undoubtedly more cost-effective to leave the city on the same day. Therefore, most of the farmers who entered the city to sell things would leave the city and return to their villages on the same day. The coins they paid would be used to pay the soldiers, repair the roads in Wallingsburg, reinforce the city walls, and many other things. However, the muddy road, full of the smell of excrement under his feet, made Harriman feel that the money was either not enough or had been used for other purposes. There was a sudden commotion at the city gate, but it was quickly suppressed. A few farmers pushing small carts retreated from the gate and made way for two people entering the city in the evening. A man and a woman rode into the city on horses. The woman was short and stout, with a large rat on her shoulder. She had a beautiful head of honey-colored blonde hair, but her eyes were cold, as if she was constantly scheming something. The man had a strong build, and his narrow hooked nose was particularly eye-catching, reminding people of vultures and scavengers. Both of them wore thick, dirty clothes, and their bodies were bulging from head to toe. They looked like horsemen who traveled through the night. However, what really caused the farmers to riot was their mounts. They were much larger than the average tapped horse. Harriman estimated that they were about 15 palms tall from their shoulders to the ground. Their bodies were pitch black, with only a tuft of white hair on their foreheads. The eyes of these two beasts were garnet red, and when they opened and closed their nostrils, a white mist would spurt out. The teeth in their mouths were not like those of ordinary horses, but sharp teeth like those of wild beasts. Harriman also noticed that the legs, chest, and waist of these two horses were covered in metal plates. Harriman, who was knowledgeable enough to match his title of Herad, could tell at a glance that there were definitely mechanical structures operating behind those metal plates. Otherwise, installing metal plates in those places would not only be meaningless, but would also increase the weight of the horses for no reason. The hooves of two tall horses stepped on the tiles near the city gate. In order to prevent the city from sinking, the city walls of Valensburg had a solid foundation, and the ground near the city gate was paved with tiles. However, the roads in Valensburg were obviously not of such high standards. The sound of the horses' hooves clanging against the stone tiles could be heard. Not only were the farmers frightened, but even the guards at the city gate who had been notified in advance were also shocked when they saw these creatures. However, because the guards knew some inside information, they were even more afraid of the two people riding on the horses. Elavera, Harriman interpreted the words from the mouths of the guards as they whispered to each other. In Tap's language, which was mixed with Pygmy language, the meaning of this accompanying word was more complicated. Enhancer or mutant, depending on stress. Harriman immediately bowed his head. Because he was going to ride out of the city, he did not wear the woolen headscarf he bought. The ornament that covered his faded hair made him look more like a farmer than a rider with a good horse. Originally, the evening sky would have helped him. After the guards received the copper coins, they would not have noticed whether his hair was reddish-brown or black. However, the two Elavera were different. According to Grice's information scroll, these modified people had keen eyesight. Even in the dark, they could find the best forest scouts of the soft maple people. At this moment, Harriman was a little envious of Old Weather. The old servant of the Green family had grayish-white hair because of his age. In addition, he could speak Tap's language fluently, so he was no different from an old Tap person. Number 27 and number 34 rode slowly on their horses. 2 days ago, they had just received an order from King Vixith. So, they returned from the swampy tidal flats east of Tapt and rushed all the way to Valensburg. Originally, their mission was to patrol the coast that was not suitable for landing, to ensure that the expeditionary force of the soft maple people did not unexpectedly choose to land there. They also had some companions who were trying their best to eliminate the spies sent by the soft maple people to the southern kingdom of Tapt. They wanted to prevent their own intelligence from leaking before the war. The reason why this special force of the kingdom was so scattered, at most, 1 or 2 people would travel together, was because each of them was very strong and capable of completing the mission alone, especially those related to killing. Secondly, the kingdom was in troubled times and could not afford to spare more manpower. Otherwise, each member of this special force had received the corresponding training. They were fully capable of training and leading an army of about 100 people into the war quickly. They were the strongest army under King Vixith's command. The training they had received since they were young ensured that there was no doubt about it. Each of them was an unparalleled blade, born from the tempering of the furnace. This was the literal meaning and not some embellishment. King Vixith searched the entire southern kingdom for these people. Some were from orphanages, some were from peasant families, and some were from wealthy merchants or noble families. However, after being selected, they had nothing to do with their past. They no longer had a name, only a code name. Only when they died in battle, which was actually very difficult, or when they had served the king for 25 years and completed their service, only half of the first batch had served, could they regain their name. Then, they would leave the army with their salary over the years, gifts from the king, and honor enough to glorify their entire family. They would spend the rest of their lives in any form they wished. This was King Vixith's promise. It was carved in the form of words on a stone pillar, and that pillar stood in the middle of the king's audience hall. Every one of the king's vassals had seen the pillar, and they were all witnesses to the promise. And in order to live up to the king's promise, candidates like number 27 and number 34 had already paid a considerable price. They were taught how to read and write from a young age, how to survive in the wild, how to lead an army, how to use strategies, and how to fight. When they grew older, these people would be hung by ropes and lowered into a place called the pit prison. In the lotus-like pits, they had to fight with murderous criminals and hungry beasts every day, using weapons and even their bare hands to fight to the death. Although there were teachers with bows and arrows standing above the pit to watch over them during the fight, and if they were injured, they could also receive treatment from doctors and spellcasters. However, there were still some candidates who ended up with physical disabilities or simply died. After a few years of elimination training, the candidates who survived were close to adulthood. Their physical indicators, height, weight, etc., were also stable. At this time, they would go through an even more cruel test. They needed to receive forging. They would take a large amount of alchemy medicine every day to deal with what happened to them. For a whole year, a few mysterious spellcasters would modify the bodies of these young people. Their flesh, bones, and internal organs would be strengthened to support the various mechanical parts transplanted into their bodies. According to the different physical conditions of each person, the modifications they received would also be different. For example, some people's skin would be completely replaced by a type of magical metal, becoming invulnerable. Some people might have one or even several mechanical arms. Number 27 and number 34. The reason why their clothes were bulging was to cover up their modified bodies. It was not because of shame, but because they all knew that before fighting with the enemy, it was best not to let the enemy figure out their actual situation. After the modifications were completed, this group of young people would officially start their service. They used their own strengths to serve King Vixith. Most of the time, they were tasked with exterminating bandit groups that roamed the borders of the country. This way, not only could they ensure the stability of the country, it could also provide these modified warriors with a chance to fight on the battlefield. Unlike many knights who swore an oath of honor, this Oliveira unit did not care about honor when carrying out their missions. Assassination, poisoning, sowing discord, they would do anything. Their honor could only be reclaimed after they retired. Before that, the king's orders were the first reason for their actions. That was why number 27 and number 34 weren't impatient when they were suddenly called back from patrolling the eastern tidal flats to Valensburg. At most, they were intensely dissatisfied with the main culprit who had caused their previous mission to be interrupted, the ambitious magistrate Macius. The actions of this feudal noble affected King Vixith's overall arrangements. The two of them came to Valensburg to try their best to maintain the stability of the place, but they also had an optional mission. Whether it was to be carried out or not depended on the judgment of these two on Macius. Chapter 1099. Brother, Black Nose thinks someone is spying on us. Number 27, who had long blonde hair, used the opportunity of combing her hair to speak to her partner using ventriloquism. Number 34 didn't respond to her. He just looked at the crowd around him. His neck was able to move much faster than normal people. Number 34 didn't have any doubts about what number 27 said. The cyborg partners trusted each other's abilities. The black rat on number 27's shoulder was actually a mechanical animal wearing a bionic coat. Its main abilities were reconnaissance and anti-reconnaissance. 38 degrees southwest. The spies are there. Number 27 interpreted the information Black Nose sent to her and immediately reminded her. This time, she said it out loud because Black Nose reported that the spies were doing something else besides spying. That guy took out a weapon. He hit a military crossbow and wants to attack us. Before she finished speaking, a crossbow bolt was shot toward number 34. The hook-nosed man's feet were already out of the stirrups. He swooped forward like an eagle. He wrapped his arms around the neck of the giant black horse under him. After circling it once, he sat back on the saddle. The crossbow bolt had already deviated from its original target. Bang! The crossbow bolt lost its target and stabbed into a small cart of a farmer leaving the city. There were still a few turnips in the cart that hadn't been sold yet. The crossbow bolt pierced into the cart and burst open, bursting into a blazing fireball. The small cart was instantly blown to pieces. The farmer pushing the cart was also killed by the flames and splashing wooden thorns. The city gate was immediately plunged into chaos. The farmers who were still in line before all fled in all directions, desperately trying to get away from this troublesome place. Some of them turned around and ran into the city, while others fearfully bypassed the 2 men and 2 horses next to the gate. They want to take advantage of the chaos to get out of Allensburg. The guards tried their best to maintain order, but because they didn't have enough manpower, they couldn't do it. They used spears and the ridges of their swords to hit the running farmers. However, the farmers who saw the scene of death were like a herd of frightened horses. This deterrent force was obviously not enough to calm them down. At this moment, the 2 Alaveras pulled the reins of their horses at the same time. The 2 huge black horses stood up and neighed. Their front hooves, which were nailed with thick iron claws, landed heavily on the brick ground near the city gate, causing brick fragments to fly everywhere. The roar of this kind of giant horse seemed to have some kind of magical power. The people who heard all involuntarily covered their ears. Some of the more timid people were so scared that they directly squatted on the ground. At the same time, no. 27 also took down a short gun that was as thick as an adult's arm from her saddle hook. She held it with one hand and pulled the trigger in one direction. Pop! A faint green smoke rose from the barrel of the gun, and a grappling claw with a rope attached to its tail shot out from the muzzle. In the blink of an eye, the grappling claw shot out dozens of meters away. The flying claw caught the shoulder of a person who had lowered his body and was trying to escape under the cover of the crowd. That person was wearing a patched brown tunic with breeches and a pair of leather sandals. He was also wearing a fur-lined jacket. The military crossbow he used to ambush number 34 was hidden in it. When the assassination failed, the person immediately took off his fur-lined jacket and wrapped it around the crossbow before throwing it to the ground. That fur-lined jacket was worth some money. If someone who saw the money picked it up, it might be able to block a disaster for him. It was a good plan. Unfortunately, he met 2 Alaveras who had eagle-like eyesight. The reason number 27 and number 34 were sent by King Vixith to patrol the eastern coast was because their eyes had been modified. The spellcasters had changed their eyes, adding more neural tissue and some sophisticated mechanical parts. Whether it was day or night, if there were no obstacles blocking their vision, they could easily see every blade of grass and tree tens of kilometers away. Moreover, within 100 meters, if they focused their eyes on someone, even a fly wouldn't be able to escape their gaze. The grappling claw dug deep into the assassin's flesh like a powerful hand gripping the shoulder blade of the assassin. Number 27, who was riding on the back of the black horse, put the musket back on the hook. She pulled the rope shot out from the muzzle and wrapped it around a protruding wheel on the horse's back. Then, she patted the horse's neck with a specific rhythm. The wheel began to spin, wrapping the rope back into a disc. At the same time, it pulled the wailing assassin to the side of the black horse. "Soft Maple Man," said number 34, leaping from his horse and tearing off the man's woolen kerchief, revealing a head of curly sallow hair. That was the color of most soft maple hair. Coupled with the wide chin, number 34 immediately made a judgment. Of course, that was only part of the answer he came up with. Every Olivera was trained to be familiar with all kinds of calculations from a young age. "You're a soft maple." The weapon you use is filled with explosive potions produced by Ramsay. You hid in Valensburg to attack King Vixitha's soldiers. However, you're not necessarily obeying the decision of the Soft Maple Mayor and the Lord's Council. After all, you Soft Maple people are all greedy idiots who only care about money. Number 34 picked the man up from the ground and whispered into his ear. The man tried his best to move his feet downwards, but he couldn't touch the ground. Ha! The assassin struggled to no avail. Suddenly, he opened his mouth and spat a thick phlegm at number 34. But even though it was only a short distance away, number 34 nimbly tilted his head and dodged the ambush. He clenched his other hand into a fist and punched the side of the assassin's waist, breaking several of the man's ribs. If you're not hopelessly stupid, you should know. Number 34 suddenly spoke in the language of the Soft Maple people. Even if a team of wolf knights under Macius came and took you away in the name of interrogation, they would not let you go in the end. Instead, they would shut you up forever. As if to prove his words, at that moment, a group of cavalry suddenly rushed out from the corner of the street opposite the city gate. The hooves of the horses splashed mud everywhere. Even if the passers-by dodged in time, they would most likely be splashed with some of the stinky mud. The people on horseback were all wearing light armor with a wolf's head painted on it. As expected, the assassin's expression changed drastically. Number 34 raised his eyelids and glanced at number 27. The female Olivera nodded almost imperceptibly. The black nose on her shoulder had the ability to detect lies. The mechanical pet could collect the breath, usually the smell of sweat, of the people around it. By detecting the presence of a certain substance, it could determine whether the person's emotions or words were true. People who lied generally could not fool the pet, unless they had the help of a very skilled spellcaster or used some kind of alchemy potion to cover their body smell. "Don't hand me over to them," the assassin said in the language of Tapt. As a Soft Maple person, he could actually speak fluent and authentic Tapt. Obviously, if this person was not a spy specially trained by the Soft Maple people to spy for information, then he was a merchant who had come to Tapt a long time ago to do business with the people of Tapt. "I'm the secret procurer of Wallingsburg," said the man, speaking quickly, endeavoring to show his worth. "First I was a smuggler, and then Messias employed me to procure flintlocks, cannons, and all sorts of alchemical materials from Ramsay, which are not found in Tapt Island. He paid with soybean oil, purple cedar wood, and gold. Today he forced me to attack you. He gave me a pound of gold and said that he wanted to see the effect of the explosive potion." Number 34 narrowed his eyes. The Alaveras were educated and knew the laws of their country very well. He knew that in addition to soybean oil, purple cedar wood and gold were goods controlled by the laws of their country. Only King Vixith had the right to decide whether to use them to trade with the merchants of the Ramsay continent. There was no doubt that Sheriff Macius had violated the laws of the country and harmed the interests of the king. Damn it! The two Alaveras made a decision at the same time. The priority of this secret mission to Wallingsburg had to be increased. No wonder he's so crazy. Keyes looked at the ceremony in front of him and could not help but feel annoyed. At this time, he was squatting on an open window in the steeple of the sheriff's mansion. However, neither the people outside nor inside the window noticed him, an uninvited guest. Macius had returned to the interior of his steeple after the end of the day of petitions. The steeple was about 150 feet tall, and there was a spiral staircase leading to the top. However, Macius did not take the stairs. Instead, he took a large basket made of pulleys and went from the bottom to a room in the center of the steeple. No one came up with him. In fact, he was the only one who could enter this room. Even the servants who cleaned the place were not allowed to enter. Those who disobeyed would be executed. After entering the room, Messias used a flint to light a lamp in a niche. The flames spread along the hidden holes in the wall, igniting all the niches around the wall. Every niche was inlaid with a silver mirror. The light of the flames was reflected by the silver mirror and gathered in the center of the room. The rays of light intertwined and formed the outline of a huge palm with 6 fingers. Great monarch of darkness, Macius softly chanted a prayer. He then took out a piece of silk soaked in the blood of a virgin and cut it in two with a dagger. He then held the two halves with both hands and extended them into the picture formed by the rays of light. You're tuning into the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.